Attend, O reader, a tale of wonder. Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. This week we're starting a new book. New book. All my homies love when we start new book. Me, I also love when we start new book because that means I get to start new book. It's just very exciting to start telling a new story. Um, this week we are doing The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells. This is definitely the first step in my big quest to pick up all the hits that I didn't quite get from H.G. Wells. You know, I did the big ones. I've done the big ones both on stream and just personally. You know, we've done War of the Worlds. We've done the Time Machine. We've done what's the one other one we've done? The other big one that H.G. Wells did. Uh, 20,000 Leagues is Jules Verne. We haven't done Journey to the Center of the Earth, but that's Jules Verne. There's one more. We've definitely done one more H.G. Wells. The Door in the Wall. That's the other H.G. Wells we did, and that's the other one that I think I had a little. I read like a chunk of that collection. There's there's a few hits from H.G. Wells that we have yet to do. We're doing The First Men in the Moon. There is. It's in the same collection as The Door in the Wall. Starts with a C. Oh, it'll come to me in the middle of reading, and then it's too late. But you know, there's some other big hits that you know how these old timey books are like, yes, by H.G. Wells, the author of this, this, and this. Uh, like there's two or three of his books that we have not quite caught yet, and one of them being that short story that is escaping my mind so dreadfully. But another being The First Man in the Moon. We have been kind of dancing around this one and a lot of his short stories. Uh, we've been doing a lot of adjacent tales, with the moon traveling and everything, but we haven't gotten around to Mr. Wells's work. Also, I have to force myself to say Mr. Wells because every time, every time, I almost say Miss Wells because of Warehouse 13. Watching Warehouse 13 as a teenager has just inserted that little seed into my brain, and I'm like this forever. And I love Warehouse 13, but he was a man. He was a man. That's alternate history, sir. That's not real people history. But this book is one I have been waiting to get around to. Kind of the core conceit, so to speak, is this journalist rolls up and is like, "Hey, what you doing?" to this mad scientist type, and this mad scientist type is like, "Yeah, I made a metal called Cavorite, and it nullifies gravity for everything in a certain direction from it. Have fun. We're going to the moon." And the journalist is like, "We're going to the moon." It's I've heard many a great thing about it, and I've been waiting to get around to it for a long time. And I have dillied and or dallied long enough. Let's get started with chapter 1. Mr. Bedford meets Mr. Cavor at Lympton. Lympton? Lympne. 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 That's how I'm gonna say it. As I sit down to write here amidst the shadows of vine leaves under the blue sky of southern Italy, it comes to me with a certain quality of astonishment that my participation in these amazing adventures of Mr. Cavor was, after all, the outcome of the purest accident. It might have been anyone. I fell into these things at a time when I thought myself removed from the slightest possibility of disturbing experiences. I had gone to Lympna because I had imagined it the most uneventful place in the world. Here, at any rate, said I shall find peace and a chance to work. And this book is the sequel. So utterly at variance is my destiny with all the little plans of men. I may perhaps mention here that very recently I had come at an ugly cropper in certain business enterprises. Sitting now surrounded by all the circumstances of wealth, there is a luxury in admitting my extremity. I can admit, even, that to a certain extent my disasters were conceivably of my own making. It may be there are directions in which I have some capacity, but the conduct of business operations is not among these. But in those days I was young, and my youth, among other objectionable forms, took that of a pride in my capacity for affairs. I am young still in years, but the things that have happened to me have rubbed something of the youth from my mind. Whether they have brought any wisdom to light below, well, that's a more doubtful matter. It is scarcely necessary to go into the details of the speculations that landed me at Lympne in Kent. Nowadays, even about business transactions, there is a strong spice of adventure. I took risks. In these things there is invariably a certain amount of give and take, and it fell to me to finally do the giving, reluctantly enough. Even when I had got out of everything, one cantankerous creditor saw fit to be malignant. Perhaps you have met that flaming sense of outraged virtue, or perhaps you have only felt it. He ran me hard. It seemed to me, at last, that there was nothing for it but to write a play, unless I wanted to drudge my living as a clerk. I have a certain imagination and luxurious taste, and I meant to make a vigorous fight for it before that fate overtook me. In addition to my belief in my powers as a businessman, I had always, in those days, had an idea that I was equal to writing a very good play. It is not, I believe, a very uncommon persuasion. I knew there is nothing a man can do outside legitimate business transactions that has such opulent possibilities, and very possibly that biased my opinion. I had indeed gotten into the habit of regarding this little unwritten drama as a convenient reserve put by for a rainy day. Well, that rainy day had come, and I had set to work. Isn't that just the way? You find yourself, uh, you find yourself overconfidently expecting to be able to write things. And when you do sit down to write, the blank page glares at you for a long while, and nothing else happens. I know I've done something similar, you know. Really, these solo tabletop stuff I've been doing on Mondays has really driven home to me how I can do short form content. I can do short stories. If I were to try to write an entire novel, I would get stuck about a fourth of the way in, and then I would go, "Oh yeah, I'll just write the middle later and write a second similar short story that I would then have to bridge the gap between to produce an entire novel." Like I would just have to write like three or four three or four small short stories and then somehow like sew them together into a novel. I could not write a novel directly. I couldn't do it. Ugh. So sorry about that. Had to had to manage a few things that you all weren't quite allowed to see. Anyway, I soon discovered that writing a play was a longer business than I had supposed. At first I had reckoned 10 days for it, and it was to have a pied-à-terre while it was in hand that I came to Lympne. I reckoned myself lucky in getting that little bungalow. I got it on a 3 years' agreement. I put in a few sticks of furniture, and while the play was in hand, I did my own cooking. My cooking would have shocked Mrs. Bond. And yet, it had flavor. I had a coffee pot, a saucepan for eggs, and one for potatoes, and a frying pan for sausages and bacon. Such was the simple apparatus of my comfort. One cannot always be magnificent, but simplicity is always a possible alternative. For the rest, I laid in an 18-gallon cask of beer on credit, and a trustful baker came each day. It was not, perhaps, in the style of Sybaris, but I have had worse times. I was a little sorry for the baker, who was a very decent man indeed, but even for him, I hoped. Also, before we get too far in here, hopefully I can do this without disturbing library too bad, I wanted to call out that we have a little drinking game going. So, H.G. Wells is very fond of a few specific words, and they come up with an incredible frequency. Uh, and before I say which words those are, I need to elucidate. I heartily suggest you do this with water. If you are of the appropriate drinking age, are allowed to do this with alcohol. But if you want to drink responsibly, you should do this with water. Because hydration is very important, and it's going to be a lot of water. So, if we hear any of the following words, take a drink. Tumult, zenith, for a space, terrible, and peculiar. H.G. Wells loves those phrases so much. So every time we hear one of those, I'm gonna go, and we're gonna all take a drink of water. Oh, where was I though? Even for him, I hoped that's where I was. Certainly, if anyone wants solitude, the place is Lympne. It is in the clay part of Kent, and my bungalow stood on the edge of an old sea cliff and stared across the flats of Romney Marsh at the sea. In very wet weather, the place is almost inaccessible, and I've heard at times that the postman used to traverse the more succulent sections of his route with boards upon his feet. I never saw him doing so, but I can quite imagine it. Outside the doors of the few cottages and houses that make up the present village, big birch besoms are stuck, to wipe off the worst of the clay, which will give you some idea of the texture of the district. I doubt if the place would be there at all if it were not a fading memory of things gone forever. It was the big port of England, at least in Roman times, the Portus Limanis, and now the sea is 4 miles away. All down the steep hill are boulders and masses of Roman brickwork, and from it old Walting Street, still paved in places, starts like an arrow to the north. I used to stand on the hill and think of it all, the galleys and legions, captives and officials, the women and the traders, and speculators like myself, all the swarm and tumult that came clanking in and out of the harbor. There's a tumult, folks, drink number one. And now, just a few lumps of rubble on a grassy slope, and perhaps a sheep or two, and of course, myself. Where the port had been, there were the levels of the marsh, sweeping round in a broad curve to distant Dungeness, and dotted here and there with tree clumps and the towers of old medieval towns that are following Lemanus now toward extinction. That outlook on the marsh was, indeed, one of the finest views I've ever seen. I suppose Dungeness was 15 miles away? Well, it lay like a raft on the sea, and farther westward were the hills by Hastings under the setting sun. Sometimes they hung close and clear, sometimes they were faded and low, and often the drift of the weather took them clean out of sight. And all the nearer parts of the marsh were laced and lit by ditches and canals. The window at which I worked looked over the skyline of this crest, and it was from this window that I first set eyes on Cavour. It was just as I was struggling with my scenario, holding down my mind to the sheer hard work of it, and naturally enough he arrested my attention. The sun had set, the sky was a vivid tranquillity of green and yellow, and against that he came out black, the oddest little figure. He was a short, round-bodied, thin-legged little man, with a jerky quality in his motions. he had seen fit to clothe his extraordinary mind in a cricket cap, an overcoat, and cycling knickerbockers and stockings. Why he did so, I do not know. He never cycled and he never played cricket. But it was a fortuitous concurrence of garments, arising I know not how. He gesticulated with his hands and arms, and jerked his head about, and buzzed. He buzzed like something electric. You never heard such buzzing. And again he cleared his throat with a most extraordinary noise. There had been rain, and the spasmodic walk of his was enhanced by the extreme slipperiness of the footpath. Exactly as he came against the sun, he stopped, pulled out a watch, and hesitated. Then, with a sort of convulsive gesture, he turned and retreated, every manifestation of haste. No longer gesticulating, but going with ample strides that showed the relatively large size of his feet. They were, I remember, grotesquely exaggerated in size by the adhesive clay, to the best possible advantage, to be fair. This occurred on my first day of my sojourn, when my playwriting energy was at its height, and I regarded the incident simply as an annoying distraction, the waste of 5 minutes. I returned to my scenario, but when the next evening the apparition was repeated with remarkable precision, and again the next, and indeed every evening when rain was not falling, concentration upon the scenario became a considerable effort. "Confound the man," I said. "One would think he's learning to be a marionette." And for several evenings I cursed him pretty heartily. Then my annoyance gave way to amazement, curiosity. Why on earth would such a man do this thing? On the 14th evening I could stand it no longer, and so soon as he appeared I opened my French window, crossed the veranda, and directed myself to the point where he invariably stopped. He had his watch out as I came up to him. He had a chubby, rubicund face with reddish-brown eyes. Previously I had only seen him against the light. "One moment, sir, if you could," said I as he turned, and he stared at me. "One moment, certainly. Or if you wish to speak to me for longer, and it's not asking too much, well, your moment is up after all. Would it trouble you to accompany me?" "Not in the least," said I, placing myself beside him. "My habits are regular. My time for intercourse is limited." "This, I presume, is your time for exercise?" "It is. I come here to enjoy the sunset." "You don't, though? You don't?" "Sir?" "You never look at it."
"Never look at what?"
"No. I've watched you 13 nights, and not once have you looked at the sunset. Not once." He knitted his brows like one who encounters a problem.
Well, I enjoy the sunlight, the atmosphere. Go along this path, through the gate."
He jerked his head over his shoulder.
"And around—"
"No, you don't. You never have been. It's all nonsense. There isn't a way. Tonight, for instance."
"Oh, tonight, let me see. I had just glanced at my watch and seen that I'd already been out 3 minutes over the precise half hour, decided there was not time to go around, and turned."
You always do that." He looked at me and reflected.
"Well, perhaps I do, now that I come to think of it, but what was it you wanted me to speak to me about?"
This."
"This?"
"Yes, this. Why do you do it? Every night you come making a noise,
Making a noise?
like this." I imitated his buzzing noise.
Zzz, zzz, zzz.
He looked at me, and it was evident the buzzing awakened distaste.
"Do I do that?"
"Every blessed evening."
"I had no idea."
He stopped dead and regarded me gravely.
"Can it be that I've formed a habit?"
Well, it looks like it, doesn't it?" He pulled down his lower lip between his finger and thumb, and regarded a puddle at his feet.
My mind is much occupied, and you want to know why. Well, sir, I can assure you that not only do I not know why I do these things, but I didn't even know I did them. And come to think, it's just as you say, I never have been beyond that field. These things, they annoy you?"
For some reason, I was beginning to relent towards him. Not annoy, but imagine yourself writing a play."
"Well, I couldn't."
"Well, anything that needs such concentration, then."
"Oh, of course." he said, and meditated for a moment. His expression became so eloquent of distress that I relented still more. After all, there's a touch of aggression in demanding a man that you don't know why he hums on a public footpath. Well, you see, it's a habit. Oh, I recognize that. I must stop it. But not if it puts you out. After all, I had no business. It's something of a liberty. No, not at all, sir, not at all. I'm greatly indebted to you. I should guard myself against these things. In the future, I will. Could I trouble you once again? That noise. Something like this? Zzz, zzz. But really, I'm greatly obligated to you. In fact, I know I'm getting quite absurdly absent-minded. You are justified, sir. Perfectly justified indeed. I am indebted to you. The thing shall end. Now, sir, I've already brought you farther than I should have done. I do hope my impertinence... No, not at all, sir, not at all. We regarded each other for a moment. I raised my hat and wished him a good evening. He responded convulsively, and so we went our ways. At the stile, I looked back at his receding figure. His bearing had changed, remarkably so. He seemed limp, shrunken. The contrast with his former gesticulating, zooing self took me in some absurd way as pathetic. I watched him out of sight. Then, wishing very heartily that I had kept my own business, I returned to my bungalow and play. The next evening I saw nothing of him, and nor the next. But he was very much in my mind, and it had occurred to me that as a sentimental comic character, he might serve a useful purpose in the development of my plot. However, the third day he called upon me. For a time I was puzzled to think of what had brought him. He had made indifferent conversation in the most formal way, then abruptly he came to business. He wanted to buy me out of my bungalow. You see, I don't blame you in the least, but you've destroyed a habit. It disorganizes my day. I've walked past you for years. Years. No doubt I've hummed, and, well, now you've made that all impossible. I suggested he might try some other direction. No, there's no other direction. This is the only one. I've inquired. Now, every afternoon at 4, I come to a dead wall. But, my dear sir, if the thing is so important to you, it's vital. You see, I'm an investigator. I'm engaged in scientific research. I live... He paused and seemed to think for a while. Just over there, he said, and pointed suddenly, dangerously near my eye. The house with white chimneys, you see, just over the trees. My circumstances are abnormal, most abnormal. I'm on the point of completing one of the most important demonstrations. I can assure you, one of the most important demonstrations that have ever been made. It requires constant thought, constant mental ease and activity, and the afternoon was my brightest time. Absolutely effervescing with new ideas, new points of view. Why not come by still, then? It'd be all different. I'd be self-conscious. I should think of you at your play, watching me irritated, instead of thinking of my work. No, I must have the bungalow. I meditated on this for a moment. Naturally, I wanted to think the matter over thoroughly before anything decisive was said. I was generally ready enough for business in those days, and selling always attracted me, but in the first place, it wasn't my bungalow, and even if I sold it to him at a good price, I might get inconvenienced in the delivery of goods if the current owner got wind of the transaction. And the second, I was, well, undischarged. It was clearly a business that required delicate handling. Moreover, the possibility of his being in pursuit of some valuable invention also interested me. It occurred to me that I would like to know more of this research, not with any dishonest intention, mind, simply with an idea that to know what it was would be a relief from playwriting. So I threw out some feelers. He was quite willing to supply information. Indeed, once he was fairly underway, the conversation became a monologue. He talked like a man long pent up, who has had it over with himself again and again. He talked for nearly an hour. I must confess I found it a pretty stiff bit of listening, but through it all there was the undertone of satisfaction that one feels when one is neglecting work one has set oneself. During that first interview I gathered very little of the drift of his work. Half his words were technicalities, entirely strange to me. He illustrated one or two points with what he was pleased to call elementary mathematics, computing on an envelope with a copying ink pencil, in a manner that made it hard even to seem to understand. Yes, yes, go on, I had said, but nevertheless I made out enough to convince me that he was no mere crank playing at a discovery, in spite of his crank-like appearance. There was a force about him. It made that conclusion impossible. Whatever it was a thing with mechanical possibilities. He told me of a work shed he had of 3 assistants, originally jobbing carpenters, whom he'd trained. Now, from the work shed to the patent office is clearly only one step. He invited me to see those things. I accepted readily, and took care, by a remark or two, to underline them. The proposed transfer of the bungalow remained very conveniently in suspense. At last he rose to depart with an apology for the length of his call. Talking over his work was, he said, a pleasure enjoyed only too rarely. It was not often he found such an intelligent listener as myself. He mingled very little with the professional scientific men. So much pettiness, so much intrigue. Really, when one has an idea, a novel, fertilizing idea even. Well, I don't want to be uncharitable, but, I am a man who believes in impulses. I made what was perhaps a rash proposition. But you must remember, I had been alone, playwriting in Lipna for 14 days. My compunction for his ruined walks still hung about me. Why not make this your new habit, in the place of the one I spoilt? At least until we can settle about the bungalow. What you want is to turn your work over in your mind, no? That you've always done during your afternoon walk, and unfortunately that's over. You can't get things back as they were, but why not come and talk about your work to me? Use me as a sort of wall against which you may throw your thoughts and catch them again. Certain I don't know enough to steal your ideas myself. I know no scientific men after all. And I stopped myself. He was clearly considering, evidently, the idea was attractive. I'm afraid I should bore you. You think I'm too dull? No, no, but technicalities. Anyhow, you've interested me immensely this afternoon. Of course, it would be a great help to me. Nothing clears up one's ideas so much as explaining them. Hitherto. Really, my dear sir, say no more. But you can spare the time, you're certain? There's no rest like the change of occupation, I said with a profound conviction, and the affair was over. On my veranda steps, he turned. I'm already greatly indebted to you. I made an interrogative noise. Hmm? You've completely cured me of that ridiculous habit of humming. I think I said I was glad to be of any service to him, and he turned away. Immediately, the train of thought that our conversation had suggested must have resumed its sway. His arms began to wave in their former fashion. The faint echo of zoo, zoo came back to me on the breeze. Well, after all, that was not my affair. He came the next day, and again the next day after that, and delivered 2 lectures on physics to our mutual satisfaction. He talked with an air of being extremely lucid about the ether and tubes of force and gravitational potential and things like that. I sat in my other folding chair and said, Yes, go on, I follow, to keep him going. It was tremendously difficult stuff, but I don't think he ever suspected how much I did not understand him. There were moments when I doubted whether I was well employed, but at any rate I was wresting him from the confounded play. Now and then things gleamed on me clearly for a moment, only to vanish when I thought I had hold of them. Sometimes my attention failed altogether, and I'd give it up and sit and stare at him, wondering whether, after all, it would not be better to use him as a central figure in a good face, and let all this other, or a central figure in a good farce, rather, and let all this other stuff slide. And perhaps I'd catch on again for a little bit. At the earliest opportunity, I went to see his house. It was large and carelessly furnished. There were no servants other than his 3 assistants, and his dietary and private life were characterized by a philosophical simplicity. He was a water drinker, a vegetarian, and all of those logical disciplinary things. But the sight of his equipment settled many doubts. It looked like business from cellar to attic, an amazing little place to find in an out-of-the-way village. The ground floor rooms contained benches and apparatus. The bakehouse and scullery boiler had developed into respectable furnaces, dynamos occupying the cellar, and there was a gasometer in the garden. He showed it to me with all the confiding zest of a man who's been living too much alone. His seclusion was overflowing now in an excess of confidence, and I had the good luck to be the recipient. Doesn't that sound familiar? His seclusion was overflowing now in an excess of confidence. That's a little relatable. Oops. I should maybe not find that so relatable. You know how it is? You sit alone with your ideas for too long and you're like, oh, these are great ideas. I have great ideas. This is lovely. Everything's fantastic. No one will ever question the things that I'm doing. It's like, it's like, my guy. A little too full of yourself. You've been thinking a little too hard about the things you've been thinking about and not talking to people. I get that. I get in that way a little too often, I think. The 3 assistants were creditable specimens of the class of handymen from which they came. Conscientious, if unintelligent, strong, civil, and willing. One, Spargus, who did all the cooking and the metal work, had been a sailor. The second, Gibbs, was a joiner, and the third was an ex-jobbing gardener, and now general assistant. They were the merest laborers. All the intelligent work was done by Cavour. Theirs was the darkest ignorance, compared even with my muddied impression of things. And now, as to the nature of these inquiries, well, here, unhappily, comes a grave difficulty. I am no scientific expert, and if I were to attempt to set forth in the highly scientific language of Mr. Cavour the aim to which his experiments tended, I'm afraid I should confuse not only the reader, but myself as well, and almost certainly I should make some blunder that would bring upon me the mockery of every up-to-date student of the mathematical physics in the country. The best thing I can do, therefore, is to think to give my impressions in my own inexact language, without any attempt to wear a garment of knowledge to which I have no claim. The object of Mr. Cavour's search was a substance that should be opaque. He used some other word that I've forgotten, but opaque conveys the idea. Opaque to all forms of radiant energy. Radiant energy, he had made me understand, was anything like light or heat or those Rontgen rays there was so much talk about a year or so ago, or the electric waves of Marconi, or even gravitation. Rontgen rays are more modernly known, I believe, as X-rays? Actually, let me fact check that, because Rontgen rays, if I recall, you measure a certain type of radiation in Rontgens because they were originally called Rontgen rays. Rontgen rays were discovered by William Rontgen, a German mechanical engineer. Electromagnetic radiation in a wavelength range known as X-rays to the modern viewer. I did remember. I wasn't sure if it was X-rays or if it was just some generalized gamma radiation. Not even gamma radiation, just generalized radiation of any sort. It could have been alpha, beta, or gamma particles for that matter. But Rontgen rays, for context, are X-rays. So, anyway, as I was saying, radiant energy, you made me understand, was anything like light or heat or those Rontgen rays there was so much talk about a year or so ago, or the electric waves of Marconi, or gravitation. All these things, he said, radiate out from some center and act on bodies at a distance, whence comes the term radiant energy. Now, almost all substances are opaque to some form or another of radiant energy. Glass, for example, is transparent to light, but much less so to heat, so that it is useful as a fire screen. And alum, for example, is transparent to light, but blocks heat completely. A solution of iodine and carbon bisulfide, on the other hand, completely blocks light, but is quite transparent to heat. It will hide a fire from you, but permit all its warmth to reach you. Metals are not only opaque to light and heat, but also to electrical energy, which passes through both iodine solution and glass as though they were not interposed, so on and so forth. Now, all known substances are transparent to gravitation. You can use screens of various sorts to cut off the light or the heat or electrical influence of the sun or the warmth of the earth from anything. You can screen things by sheets of metal from Marconi's rays, but nothing cuts off the gravitational attraction of the sun or the gravitational attraction of the earth. Yet why there should be nothing that is so opaque should be hard to say. Cavour did not see why such a substance should not exist, and certainly I could not tell him. I'd never thought of such a possibility before. He showed me by calculations on paper, which Lord Kelvin, no doubt, or Professor Lodge, or Professor Karl Pearson, or any of those great scientific people might have understood, but which simply reduced me to a hopeless muddle, that not only was such a substance possible, but that it must satisfy certain conditions. It was an amazing piece of reasoning, to be fair. Much as it amazed and exercised me at the time, it would be impossible to reduce it here, or reproduce it here. Yes, I said to it. Yes, I said to it all. Yes, go on. Suffice it for this story that he believed he might be able to manufacture this possible substance, opaque to gravitation, out of a complicated alloy of metals and something new, a new element, I fancy, called, I believe, helium, which was sent to him from London in sealed stone jars. Doubt has been thrown upon this particular detail, but I am almost certain it was helium that he had sent to him in sealed stone jars. It was certainly something very gaseous and thin. If only I had taken notes. This is very interesting to me. This bent of light and heat and electromagnetic radiation is how this thing interacts. So why isn't gravitation also a radiative wave? Which is very interesting to me because there's still kind of that there's little seeds of that idea still in certain theories. With the graviton, for example, they're like, oh yeah, the gravitons provide gravitation to this material. It's merely a particle rather than a wave. I think it's very interesting. And also, it's very I'm curious to see if the story remains self-consistent about, oh yes, gravitation is a wave and it's blocked by this mystery material. It'll be very interesting to see where this goes. But then, how was I to foresee the necessity of taking notes? Anyone with the merest germ of imagination will understand the extraordinary possibilities of such a substance, and will sympathize a little with the emotion I felt as this understanding emerged from the haze of abstruse phrases in which Cavour expressed himself. Comic relief in a play, indeed. It was some time before I believed that I had interpreted him all right, and I was very careful not to ask questions that would have enabled him to gauge the profundity of my misunderstanding, into which that he dropped his daily exposition. But no one reading the story of it here will sympathize fully, because from my barren narrative it should be impossible to gather the strength of my conviction that this astonishing substance was positively going to be made. I do not recall that I gave my play an hour's consecutive work, at any time after my visit to his house. My imagination had anything else to do. There seemed to be no limit to the possibilities of the stuff. Whichever way I tried, I came on miracles and revolutions. For example, if one wanted to lift a weight, however enormous, one had only to get a sheet of this substance beneath it, and one might lift it with a straw. My first natural impulse was to apply this principle to guns and ironclads, all the materials and methods of war, and from that to shipping, locomotion, building, every conceivable form of human industry. The chance that this had brought me, in the very birth chamber of a new time, well, it was an epoch, no less. It was one of those chances that comes once in 1,000 years. The thing unrolled, it expanded and expanded. Other things I saw in it in my redemption as a businessman. I saw a parent company, daughter companies, applications to right of us, applications to lefts, rings and trusts, privileges, concessions, spreading and spreading, until one vast, stupendous Cavorite company ran and ruled the world, and I was in it. I took my line straight away. I knew that I was staking everything, but I jumped there and then. We must be on absolutely the biggest thing that's ever been invented, I said, and put the accent on we. If you want to keep me out of this, you'll have to do it with a gun. I'm coming down to be your fourth laborer tomorrow. He seemed surprised at my enthusiasm, but not a bit suspicious or hostile. Rather, he was self-depreciatory. He looked at me doubtfully. Do you really think? What about your play? How about that play? Oh, it's vanished. My dear sir, don't you see what you've got? Don't you see what you're going to do? This was merely a rhetorical turn, but positively he didn't. At first I couldn't believe it. He had not had the beginning of the inkling of an idea. This astonishing little man had been working on a purely theoretical ground the whole time. When he said it was the most important research the world had ever seen, he simply meant it squared up so many theories, settled so much that was in doubt. He had troubled no more about the application of the stuff he was going to turn out than if he had been a machine that makes guns. This was a possible substance. He was going to make it. Villetaut, as the Frenchman says. Frenchmen probably don't say it quite like I did, but, you know. Beyond that, he was childish. If he made it, it would go down to posterity as Cavorite or Cavorine, and he would be made an FRS and his portrait given away as a scientific worthy with nature, and things like that, and that was all he saw. He would have dropped this bombshell into the world as though he'd discovered a new species of gnat, if it had not happened that I'd come along. And there it would have lain and fizzled like one or two other things these scientific people have lit and dropped about us. When I realized this, it was I who did the talking, and Cavour who said go on. I jumped up and paced the room, gesticulating like a boy of 20. I tried to make him understand his duties and responsibilities, our duties and responsibilities in the matter. I assured him that we might make wealth enough to work any sort of social revolution we fancied. We might own and order the whole world. I told him of companies and patents and the case for secret processes. All these things seemed to take him as much as his mathematics had taken me. A look of perplexity came into his ruddy little face. He stammered something about indifference to wealth, but I brushed all that aside. He had got to be rich, and it was no good that he was stammering. I gave him to understand the sort of man that I was, and that I had had very considerable business experience. I didn't tell him that I was an undischarged bankrupt at the time, because that was temporary. But I think I reconciled my evident poverty with my financial claims. And quite insensibly, in the way such projects grow, the understanding of the Cavorite monopoly grew up between us. He was to make the stuff, and I was to make the boom. This is a very American angle on things for this to be a British man, but it definitely this guy went from oh yeah I'll be a playwright to I am now an iron-fisted capitalist and I'm going to hold the private patent on this thing and I'm going to make so much money.
Just immediately. Love it.
I stuck like a leech to the we, you. I practically didn't exist for me. His idea was that the prophesied spoke of might go to endow further research, but that was, of course, a matter we had to settle later. Oh, that's all right, that's all right, I shouted. The great point, as I insisted, was to get the thing done. Here is a substance no home, no factory, no fortress, no ship can dare to be without, more universally applicable than even a patent medicine. There isn't a solitary aspect of it, not one of its 10,000 possible uses, that would not make us rich, Cavor, beyond the dreams of avarice. Oh, no, no, I begin to see. It's extraordinary how one gets new points of view by talking over things. And as it happens, you've just talked to the right man. Well, I suppose no one is absolutely averse to enormous wealth. Of course, there is one thing. At this, he paused, and I stood still. And it's just possible, that we may not be able to make it after all. Maybe one of those things that's a theoretical possibility, but a practical absurdity. Or when we make it, there may be some little hitch. Oh, we'll tackle the hitch when it comes along. Chapter 2. The First Making of Cavorite. But Cavor's fears were groundless, so far as the actual making was concerned. On the 14th of October, 1899, that does say 1899, yes. The 14th of October, 1899, this incredible substance was made. Oddly enough, it was made at last by accident, when Mr. Cavor least expected it. He had fused together a number of metals and certain other things. Oh, I wish I knew the particulars now. He intended to leave the mixture a week and then allow it to cool slowly. Unless he had miscalculated, the last stage in the combination would occur when the stuff sank to a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. But it chanced that, unknown to Cavor, dissension had arisen about the furnace tending. Gibbs, who had previously seen to this, had suddenly attempted to shift it to the man who had been a gardener, on the score that coal was soil being dug, and therefore could not possibly fall within the province of a joiner. The man who had been a jobbing gardener alleged, however, that the coal was metallic or an ore-like substance, let alone that he was the cook. But Spargus insisted on Gibbs doing the coaling, seeing that he was a joiner. The coal is notoriously fossil wood. Consequently, Gibbs ceased to replenish the furnace, and no one else did so, and Cavor was so much immersed in a certain interesting problem concerning a Cavorite flying machine, neglecting the resistance of the air and one or two other points, to perceive that anything was wrong, and the premature birth of his invention took place just as he was coming across the field to my bungalow for our afternoon talk and tea. I remember the occasion with extreme vividness. The water was boiling and everything was prepared, and the sound of his zzzoo had brought me out upon the veranda. His active little figure was black against the autumnal sunset, and to the right the chimneys of his house just rose above a gloriously tinted group of trees. Remoter rose the Walden hills, faint and blue, while to the left the hazy marsh spread out, spacious and serene. And then chimneys jerked heavenward, smashing into a string of bricks as they rose, and the roof and a miscellany of furniture followed. Then, overtaking them, came a huge white flame. The trees about the building swayed and whirled and tore themselves to pieces, that sprang toward the flare. My ears were smitten with a clap of thunder that left me deaf on one side for life, and all about me windows smashed unheeded. I took 3 steps from the veranda toward Cavor's house, and even as I did so, came the wind. Instantly my coat-tails were up over my head, and I was progressing in great leaps and bounds, quite against my will, toward him. In the same moment the discoverer was seized, whirled about, and flew through the screaming air. I saw one of my chimney pots hit the ground within 6 yards of me, leap a score of feet, and so hurry in great strides toward the focus of the disturbance. Cavor, kicking and flapping, came down again, rolled over and over on the ground for a space, struggled up and was lifted and borne forward at an enormous velocity, vanishing at last among the laboring, lashing trees that writhed about his house. He did something for a space. We all got a drink, gang. Not gonna lie, I think I was expecting to get more. I was expecting to get more drinks because last time we did the drinking game, for Wells's, I believe it was Door on the Wall, one of Wells's short stories, we were constantly drinking. So I'm surprised we haven't run into more. I'm sure we'll find a few more as we go. Anyway, a mass of smoke and ashes and a square of bluish shining substance rushed up towards the zenith. A large fragment of fencing came sailing past me, dropped edgeways, hit the ground, and fell flat. Then the worst was over. The aerial commotion fell swiftly till it was merely a strong gale, and I became once more aware that I had breath and feet. By leaning back against the wind, I had managed to stop, and could collect such wits as still remained to me. In that instant, the whole face of the world had changed. Tranquil sunset had vanished, the sky was dark with scurrying clouds, everything was flattened and swaying with the gale. I glanced back to see if my bungalow was in a general way still standing, then staggered forward toward the trees amongst which Cavour had vanished, and through whose tall and leaf-denuded branches shone the flames of his burning house. I entered the copse, dashing from one tree to another, and clinging to them. For a space I sought him in vain. My complaints have been heard. Drink again. Then, amidst a heap of smashed branches and fencing that had banked itself against a portion of the garden wall, I perceived something stir. I made a run for this, but before I reached it, a brown object separated itself, rose on two legs, and protruded two drooping, bleeding hands. Some tattered ends of the garments flooded out from its middle portion and streamed before the wind. For a long moment I did not recognize this earthy lump. Then I saw that it was Cavour, caked in the mud in which he had rolled. He leaned forward against the wind, rubbing the dirt from his eyes and mouth, and extended a muddy lump of hand, and staggered a pace toward me. His face worked with emotion. Little lumps of mud kept falling from him. He looked as damaged and pitiful as any living creature I've ever seen, and his remark therefore amazed me exceedingly. Congratulate me. Congratulate me. Congratulate you? What for? I've done it. No, you've done something. What on earth caused that explosion? A gust of wind blew his words away. I understood him to say that it wasn't an explosion at all. The wind hurled me into a collision with him, and we stood clinging to one another. Try and get back to my bungalow, I bawled in his ear. He didn't hear me and shouted something about 3 martyrs, science, something about not much good. At the time, he labored under the impression his 3 attendants had perished in the whirlwind. Happily, this was incorrect. Directly he had left for my bungalow, they had gone off to the public house in Limpna to discuss the question of the furnaces over some trivial refreshment. I repeated my suggestion of getting back to my bungalow, and this time he understood. We clung to each other arm in arm and started, managing at last to reach the shelter of as much roof as was left to me. For a space we sat in armchairs and panted. Everybody drink. Have some water. All the windows were broken, and the lighter articles from furniture were in great disorder, but no irrevocable damage was done. Happily, the kitchen door had stood the pressure upon it, so that all my crockery and cooking materials had survived. That was a very bright and very nearby lightning strike. There it is.
So I could tell you all couldn't hear all of that. That was really long and really low thunder. That was a good like 15 seconds of like thunder. Like that was genuinely impressive. It sounded like somebody shaking a giant piece of metal. No wonder I was like, oh, because I saw it. Like there is one uncurtained window in here, and that's on purpose. It's the driving window, and I saw it flash, and I was like, oh, that must be pretty close. It was not very close. It took a while to get here, but it was very loud. Anyway, kitchen door, crockery. The oil stove was still burning, and I put on the water to boil again for tea. And all that prepared, I could turn on Cavor for his explanation.
Quite correct, quite correct. I've done it and it's all right.
But, all right. There can't be a rick standing or fence or thatched roof undamaged for 20 miles around.
It's all right, really. I didn't, of course, foresee this little upset. My mind was preoccupied with another problem. I'm apt to regard all the practical side issues, but it's all right.
My dear sir, don't you see you've done thousands of pounds worth of damage?
No, there, I throw myself on your discretion. I'm not a practical man, of course, but well, don't you think people would regard it as a cyclone?
But the explosion.
And that was no explosion. It's perfectly simple. Only, as I say, I'm apt to overlook the little things. That's a zoo business on a larger scale. Inadvertently, I made this substance of mine, this Cavorite, in a thin, wide sheet. You're quite clear that this stuff is opaque to gravitation. It cuts off things from gravitating toward each other.
Yes. Yes, of course.
Well, so soon as it reached a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the process of its manufacture being complete, the air above it, the portions of roof and ceiling of floor above it, ceased to have weight. I suppose you know, everybody knows nowadays, that as a usual thing, the air itself has weight. Presses on everything, the surface of the earth, presses in all directions, about 14.5 pounds to a square inch.
I know that. Go on.
I know that too, only, this shows you how useless knowledge is unless you apply it. You see, over our Cavorite, this ceased to be the case. The air there ceased to exert any pressure. The air around it, and not over the Cavorite, was exerting a pressure of 14 pounds and a half to the square inch upon this suddenly weightless air. Now you begin to see. The air all about the Cavorite crushed in upon the air above it with an irresistible force. And the air above the Cavorite was forced upward violently. The air that rushed in to replace it immediately lost weight, ceased to exert pressure, followed suit, blew the ceiling through, and the roof off, so on and so forth. Recursive process, as you understand. You perceive that it formed a sort of atmospheric fountain, a kind of chimney in the atmosphere. If the Cavorite itself hadn't gotten loose, and so got sucked up the chimney, does it occur to you what would have happened?
I suppose the air would be rushing up and over that infernal piece of stuff now.
Precisely. A huge fountain, so spouting into space!
Good heavens, it could have squirted all the atmosphere of the earth away. Would have robbed the world of air. Could have been the death of all mankind, the little lump of stuff.
Not exactly into space, but just as bad, practically speaking. Would have whipped the air off the world as one peels a banana, flung it thousands of miles. It would have dropped back again, of course, but on an asphyxiated world. From our point of view, very little better than if it never came back.
I stared. As yet, I was too amazed to realize how all my expectations had been upset. What do you mean to do now?
In the first place, if I may borrow a garden trowel, I'll remove some of this earth which I'm encased. Then I may avail yourself of your domestic conveniences. And I'll have myself a bath. This done, we can converse a bit more at leisure. It'll be wise, I think.
And at this he laid a muddy hand on my arm.
If nothing were said of this affair beyond ourselves. I know I've caused great damage. Probably even dwelling houses may be ruined here and there along the countryside, but on the other hand, I cannot possibly pay for the damage I've done. the real cause of this is published, it'll only lead to heartburning and the obstruction of my work. One cannot foresee everything, you know. I don't consent for a moment to add the burden of practical considerations to my theorizing. Later on, when you've come in with your practical mind and Cavorite is floated, well, floated is the word, isn't it? And it is realized all you anticipate for, we may set matters right with these persons, but not now, not now. If no other explanation is offered, people in the pleasant, unsatisfactory state of meteorological science will ascribe this all to a cyclone. There might be a public subscription. My house has collapsed and been burnt. I should, in that case, receive a considerable share in the compensation, which would be extremely helpful to the prosecution of our researches. But if it's known that I caused this, there will be no public subscription. Everyone will get put out. And practically, I should never get a chance of working in peace again. That was a massive peal of thunder. It's, let me see if you all can hear the rain here for a moment. You can very, very occasionally faintly hear the rain. It is relatively gently raining right now, but there are lightning strikes all over the place. Something about this storm must have the appropriate convections or something to bring down all this lightning. Or maybe bring up? I've never understood if the charge imbalance that causes lightning forces lightning out of the ground to compensate or down from the cloud. All I know is the leader charge is like a little baby, like, and it connects, and then all the lightning comes. Hang on, we'll wait for the thunder again. Oh, no thunder from that one. Yeah, if it were not, if I were not reading right now, I'd be sitting happily in front of a window, like, ooh, rain, ooh, lightning. I love watching lightning. It's fascinating to me. All that, fractallary detail that you can kind of sort of see for just a moment. It's very pretty. Anyway, chance of working in peace again, I believe, is where we left off. My 3 assistants may or may not have perished. That's a detail. If they have, it's no great loss. They were more zealous than able, and this premature event must be largely due to their joint neglect of the furnace. If they have not perished, I doubt if they have the intelligence to explain the affair. They'll accept the cyclone story. If during that temporary unfitness of my house for occupation, I may lodge in one of the untenanted rooms of this bungalow of yours. He paused and regarded me at this. A man of such possibilities, I reflected, is no ordinary guest to entertain. Perhaps, I said, rising to my feet, we'd better begin by looking for a trowel. And I led the way to the scattered vestiges of my greenhouse. And while he was having his bath, I considered the entire question alone. It was clear there were drawbacks to Mr. Cavor's society that I had not foreseen. The absent-mindedness that had just escaped depopulating the terrestrial globe might at any moment result in some other grave inconvenience. On the other hand, I was young, my affairs were in a mess, and I was in just the mood for a reckless adventure, with a chance of something good at the end of it. I had quite settled in my mind that I was to have half, at least, of that aspect of the affair. Fortunately, I held my bungalow, as I already explained, on a 3-year agreement, without being responsible for repairs, mind. My furniture, such as there was of it, had been hastily purchased, and was unpaid for, insured, and altogether devoid of associations. In the end, I decided to keep on with him, and see the business through. Certainly, the aspect of things had changed very greatly. I no longer doubted at all the enormous possibilities of the substance, but I began to have doubts about the gun carriage and the patent booths. We set at work at once to reconstruct his laboratory and proceed with our experiments. Cavor talked more on my level than he'd ever done before when it came to the question of how we should make the stuff next. "No, of course we should make it again," he said, with a sort of glee I had not expected in him. "But of course we must make it again. We've caught a tartar, perhaps, but have left the theoretical behind us for good and all. If we can possibly avoid wrecking this little planet of ours, we will, but there must be risks. There must be. In experimental work, there's always risks. And here, as a practical man, you must come in. For my own part, it seems to me we might make it edgeways, perhaps, and very thin. Yet I don't know. I have a certain dim perception of another method. I can hardly explain it yet. But curiously enough, it came into my mind while I was rolling over and over in the mud for the win. It was very doubtful how the whole adventure was to end, as being absolutely the thing I ought to have done. Even with my aid, we found some little difficulty, and meanwhile we kept at work restoring the laboratory. There was plenty to do before it became absolutely necessary to decide upon the precise form and method of our second attempt. Our only hitch was the strike of the 3 laborers who objected to my activity as a foreman. Okay, that doesn't come across in the audio very badly. I think I can just keep talking. Foreman. But that matter we comprised after 2 days' delay. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see anything of Magnus in the library tonight. Magnus is actually really quite comfy where he is. He's just sitting in a chair slightly to my right. But library at that first thunder peal immediately hid under the couch, so we probably won't be seeing anything of him. I might check for him during the Be Right Back, but let's keep going, shall we? Chapter 3. The Building of the Sphere. I remember the occasion very distinctly when Cavour told me of his idea of the sphere. He had had intimations of it before, but at the time it seemed to come to him in a rush. We were returning to the bungalow for tea, and on the way he fell humming. Suddenly he shouted, "That's it! That finishes it! A sort of roller blind!" Finishes what? Space, anywhere, the moon. What do you mean? Mean? Why, it must be a sphere, that's what I mean. I saw I was out of it, and for a time I let him talk in his own fashion. I hadn't the ghost of an idea to let then. I hadn't the ghost of an idea then of his drift, but after he'd taken tea, he had made it much more clear to me. It's like this. The last time I ran this stuff that cut things off from gravitation into a flat tank with an overlap that held it down, and directly it had cooled, the manufacture was completed, all that uproar had happened. Nothing above it weighed anything. The air went squirting up. House squirted up, and if the stuff itself hadn't squirted up too, I don't know what would have happened. But suppose the substance is loose and quite free to go up. Well, it'll go up at once. Exactly. With no more disturbance than firing a big gun. What good will that do? I'm going up with it. I put down my teacup and stared at him. Imagine a sphere, large enough to hold 2 people and their luggage. Be made of steel lined with thick glass. It'll contain a proper store of solidified air, concentrated food, water distilling apparatus, so on and so forth, and enameled, as it were, on the outer steel. Cavorite? Yes. But how will you get inside? There was a similar problem about a dumpling. Yes, I know, but how? It's perfectly easy. An airtight manhole's all that's needed. That, of course, will have to be a little complicated. There ought to be a valve, so that things may be thrown out, if necessary, without much loss of air. Like Jules Verne's thing in The Trip to the Moon. But Cavour was not a reader of fiction. I begin to see. And you could get in and screw yourself up while the cavorite was warm, and as soon as it cooled, you would become impervious to gravitation, and you'd fly off at a tangent. You'd go off in a straight line. What is to prevent the thing traveling in a straight line into space forever? You're not safe to get anywhere, and then if you do, how will you get back? I just thought of that. That's what I meant when I said the thing is finished. And the inner glass sphere can be airtight, and except for the manhole, continuous. The steel sphere can be made in sections, each section capable of rolling up after the fashion of a roller blind. These can be easily worked by springs and released and checked by electricity conveyed through platinum wires fused through the glass. All that is merely a question of detail. So you see that except for the thickness of the blind rollers, the Cavorite exterior of the sphere will consist of the windows or blinds, whichever you like to call them. When all those windows or blinds are shut, no light, no heat, no gravitation, no radiant energy of any sort, really, will get inside of the sphere. It'll fly on through space in a straight line, as you say. But open a window, imagine one of the windows open. Then, once any heavy body that chances to be in that direction will attract us. I sat, taking it in. Do you see where I'm going?
Oh, I see.
Practically, we'll be able to tack about in space just as we wish. Get attracted only by this and that.
Yes, that's clear enough, only...
Well,
I don't quite see what we shall do it for. It's really only jumping off the world and back again.
oh, surely. For example, one might go to the moon.
And when one got there, what would you find?
We should see, consider all the new knowledge.
Is there air?
There may be. There may be.
It's a fine idea, but it strikes me as a large order all the same. The moon? I'd rather try some smaller things first.
They're out of the question because of the air difficulty.
Why not apply that idea of spring blinds, Cavorite blinds, and strong steel cases to lifting weights?
Well, that wouldn't work. After all, to go into outer space is not so much worse, if at all, than a polar expedition. Men go on polar expeditions.
Not businessmen. Besides, they get paid for polar expeditions. If anything goes wrong, there are relief parties. It's firing ourselves off the world for nothing.
Call it prospecting.
You'll have to call it that. One might make a book of it, perhaps.
I have no doubt there will be minerals.
For example?
Sulfur, ores, gold, perhaps, possibly new elements.
Cost of carriage. You know you're not a practical man. The moon's... the moon, it's 250,000 miles away.
It seems to me it wouldn't cost much to cart any weight anywhere if you packed it in a Cavorite case.
I hadn't thought of that.
Delivered
Free on head of purchaser, huh?
Well, it isn't as though we're confined to the moon.
What do you mean?
There's Mars. Clear atmosphere, novel surroundings, exhilarating sense of lightness. Might be pleasant to go there.
Is there air on Mars?
Oh, yes.
Seems as though you might run it as a sanatorium. How far is Mars anyway?
200 million miles at present. And, well, you go close by the sun,
said Caver airily. My imagination was picking itself up again. After all, there's something in these things. There's travel. An extraordinary possibility came rushing into my mind. Suddenly I saw, as in a vision, the whole solar system threaded with Cavorite liners and spheres deluxe. Rights of preemption came floating in my head. Planetary rights of preemption. I recalled the old Spanish monopoly in American gold. It wasn't as though it was just this planet or that. It was all of them. I stared at Cavor's rubicund face, and suddenly my imagination was leaping and dancing. I stood up. I walked up and down. My tongue was unloosened. I'm beginning to take it in. Yes, I'm beginning to take it in. Transition from doubt to enthusiasm seemed to take scarcely any time at all. This is tremendous. This is imperial. I haven't been dreaming of this sort of thing. Once the chill of my opposition was removed, his own pent-up excitement had gotten into play. He too got up and paced. We gesticulated and shouted. We behaved like men inspired. We were men inspired.
We'll settle all that, he said in answer to some incidental difficulty that had rolled me up. We'll soon settle that. We'll start with the drawings for moldings this very night.
We'll start them now. And we hurried off to the laboratory to begin upon this work forthwith. I was like a child in Wonderland all that night. The dawn found us still both at work. We kept our electric light going, heedless of the day. I remember now exactly how those drawings looked. I shaded and tinted while Caver drew. Smudged and haste-marked they were in every line, but wonderfully correct. We got out the orders for the steel
We got out the orders for the steel blinds and the frames we needed from that night's work, and the glass sphere was designed within a week. We gave up our afternoon conversations and our old routine altogether. We worked and slept and ate when we could work no longer for hunger and fatigue. Our enthusiasm infected even our three men, though they had no idea what the sphere was for. Through those days, the man Gibbs gave up walking and went everywhere, even across the room, in a sort of fussy run. And it grew. The sphere, I mean. December passed. January, I spent a day with a broom, sweeping a path through the snow from the bungalow to the laboratory. February, March. By the end of March, the completion was in sight. In January had come a team of horses, a huge packing case. We had our thick glass sphere now ready, and in position under the crane we had rigged it to sling into the steel shell. All the bars and blinds of the steel shell, well, it wasn't really a spherical shell, but polyhedral, with a roller blind to each facet. They had arrived by February, and the lower half was bolted together. The Cavorite was half made by March. The metallic paste had gone through two of the stages in its manufacture, and we had plastered quite half of it onto the steel bars and blinds. It was astonishing how closely we kept the lines of Cavor's first inspiration in working out the scheme. When the bolting together of the sphere was finished, he proposed to remove the rough roof of the temporary laboratory in which the work was done and build a furnace about it. So the last stage of Cavorite making, in which the paste is heated to a dull red glow in a stream of helium, would be accomplished when it was already on the sphere. And then we had to discuss and decide what provisions we were to take. Compressed food, concentrated essences, steel cylinders containing reserve oxygen, an arrangement for removing carbonic acid and waste from the air, and restoring oxygen by means of sodium peroxide, water condensers, so on and so forth. I remember the little heap they made in the corner, tins and rolls and boxes, convincingly matter of fact. It was a strenuous time, with little chance of thinking, but one day, when we were drawing near the end, an odd mood came over me. I had been bricking up the furnace all morning, and I sat down by these possessions, dead beat. Everything seemed dull and incredible. Look here, Cavor. After all, what's this all for?
I think now is to go.
Moon. What do you expect? I thought the moon was a dead world. He shrugged at this.
We're gonna see.
Are we?
You're tired. You'd better take a walk this afternoon.
No. I'm going to finish this brickwork, I said obstinately. And I did, and ensured myself a night of insomnia. I don't think I've ever had such a night. I had some bad times before my business collapsed, but the very worst of those was sweet slumber compared to this infinity of aching wakefulness. I was suddenly in the most enormous funk at the idea of the thing we were going to do. I do not remember before that night thinking at all of the risk we were running, but now they came like that array of spectres that once beleaguered Prague and camped about me. The strangeness of what we were about to do, the unearthliness of it, it overwhelmed me. I was like a man awakened out of pleasant dreams to the most horrible surroundings. I lay, eyes wide open, and the sphere seemed to get more flimsy and feeble, and Cavor more unreal and fantastic, the whole enterprise madder and madder every moment. I got out of bed and wandered about. I sat at the window and stared at the immensity of space. Between the stars was the void, that unfathomable darkness. I tried to recall the fragmentary knowledge of astronomy that I'd gained in my irregular reading, but it was all too vague to furnish any idea of the things we might expect. At last I got back to bed and snatched some moments of sleep, rather some moments of nightmare, in which I fell and fell and fell forevermore into the abyss of the sky. I astonished Cavor at breakfast. I told him, shortly, I'm not coming with you in the sphere. I met all his protests with a sullen persistence. The thing's too mad. I won't come. This thing is too mad. I would not go with him to the laboratory. I fretted about my bungalow for a time, then took hat and stick and set out alone, I knew not whither. It chanced to be a glorious morning. There was a warm wind and a deep blue sky, the first green of spring all abroad, and multitudes of birds singing. I lur- I I lunched on beef and beer in a little public house near Elm, and startled the landlord by remarking apropos of the weather, "A man who leaves the world when the days of this sort are about are a fool." Yeah, that's what I said when I heard on it," said the landlord, and I found that for one poor soul at least, this world had proved excessive. There had been a throat cutting. I went on with a new twist to my thoughts. In the afternoon I had a pleasant sleep in a sunny place, and went on my way, refreshed. I came to a comfortable-looking inn near Canterbury. It was bright with creepers, and the landlady was a clean old woman, and took my eye. I found that I had just enough money to pay for my lodging with her. I decided to stop the night there. She was a talkative body, and among many other particulars, I learnt that she has never been as far to London. "Canterbury's as far as I've ever been. I'm not one of your gadabout sorts." "How'd you like a trip to the moon?" "I never did hold with them balloonies," she said, evidently under the impression this was a common excursion enough. "I wouldn't go up in one, not for ever so." This struck me as being kind of funny. After I had supped, I sat on a bench by the door of the inn and gossiped with two labourers about brick-making and motor cars and the cricket of last year. And in the sky a faint new crescent, blue and vague as a distant Alp, sank westward over the sun. The next day I returned to Cavour. "I'm coming. I've been a little out of sorts, been a little out of order, that's all." That was the only time I felt any serious doubt about our enterprise. Nerves, purely. After that I worked a little more carefully, and took a trudge for an hour every day. And at last, save for the heating in the furnace, our labors were at an end. Chapter 4. Inside the Sphere. "Go on," said Cavour, as I sat across the edge of the manhole, and looked down into the black interior of the sphere. We two were alone. It was evening, the sun had set, and the stillness of the twilight was upon everything. I drew my other leg inside, and slid down the smooth glass to the bottom of the sphere, then turned to take the cans of food and other impedimenta from Cavour. The interior was warm, the thermometer stood at 80, and as we should lose little or none of this by radiation, we were dressed in shoes and thin flannels. We had, however, a bundle of thick woolen clothing and several thick blankets to guard against mischance. By Cavour's direction, I placed the packages, the cylinders of oxygen, and so forth, loosely about my feet, and soon we had everything in. He walked about the roofless shed for a time, seeking anything we had overlooked, then crawled in after me. I noticed something in his hand. "What have you got there?"
"Haven't you brought anything to read?"
"Good Lord, no."
"I forgot to tell you. There are uncertainties. The voyages may last, well, we may be weeks.
But
we shall be floating in the sphere with absolutely no occupation."
I wish I'd known." He peered out of the manhole.
Look, there's something there."
"Is there time?"
"We shall be an hour."
I looked out. It was an old number of titbits that one of the men must have brought. Farther away in the corner, I saw a torn Lloyd's News. I scrambled back into the sphere with these things. "What have you got?" I took the book from his hand and read the works of William Shakespeare. He colored slightly.
"My education has been so purely scientific."
You've never read it?"
"Never."
"Well, he knew a little, you know, in a regular sort of way."
"That's precisely what I've been told."
I assisted him to screw in the glass cover of the manhole. Then he pressed a stud to close the corresponding blind in the outer case. Our little oblong of twilight vanished. We were in darkness. For a time, neither of us spoke. Although our case would not be impervious to sound, everything was very still.
I perceived there was nothing to grip when the shock of our start should come, and I realized that I should be uncomfortable for want of a chair. Why have we no chairs?
I've settled all that. We won't need them.
Why not?
You'll see.
He said, in the tone of a man who refuses to talk. I became silent. Suddenly it had come to me, clear and vivid, that I was a fool to be inside that sphere. Even now I ask myself, is it too late to withdraw? The world outside the sphere I knew would be cold and inhospitable enough for me. And for weeks I'd been living on subsidies for Cavorite, but after all, would it be as cold as the infinite zero, as inhospitable as an empty space? If it had not been for the appearance of cowardice, I believe that even then I should have made him let me out. But I hesitated on that score, and hesitated and grew fretful, angry, and the time passed. There came a little jerk, a noise like a champagne being uncorked in another room, and a faint whistling sound. For just one instant I had a sense of enormous tension, a transient conviction that my feet were pressing downward with a force of countless tons. It lasted for an infinitesimal time, but it stirred me to action. Cavor, my nerves are in rags. I don't think. I stopped myself as I spoke in the darkness. He made no answer. Confound it, I'm a fool. What business have I here? I'm not coming, Cavor. The thing's too risky. I'm getting out.
No, you can't now.
Can't. We'll see about that. He made no answer for about 10 seconds.
It's too late for us to quarrel now, Bedford. That little jerk was the start. Already, we're flying as swiftly as a bullet up into the gulf of space.
I had started to say something, and it didn't seem to matter what happened. For a long time I was, as it were, stunned. I had nothing to say. It was just as if I had never heard of this idea of leaving the world before. Then I perceived an unaccountable change in my bodily sensations. It was a feeling of lightness, of unreality. Coupled with that was a queer sensation in the head, an apoplectic effect almost, a thumping of blood vessels in the ears. Neither of these feelings diminished as time went on, but at last I got so used to them that I experienced no inconvenience. I heard a click, and a little glow lamp came into being. I saw Cavor's face, as white as I felt my own to be. We regarded one another in silence. The transparent blackness of the glass behind him made him seem as though he floated in a void. Well, we're committed.
Yes, we're committed. Now don't move, he exclaimed with some suggestion of a gesture. Let your muscles keep quite relaxed as if you were in bed. We are in a little universe of our own. Look at those things.
He pointed to the loose cases and bundles that had been lying on the blankets in the bottom of the sphere. I was astonished to see that they were floating now, nearly a foot from the spherical wall. Then I saw from his shadow that Cavor was no longer leaning against the glass. I thrust out my hand behind me and found that I too was suspended in space, clear of the glass. I did not cry out nor gesticulate, but fear came upon me. It was like being held and lifted by something, but you know not what. The mere touch of my hand against the glass moved me rapidly. I understood what had happened, but that did not prevent my being afraid. We were cut off from all exterior gravitation. Only attraction of objects within our sphere had any effect. Consequently, everything that wasn't fixed to the glass was falling, slowly because of the slightness of our masses, toward the center of gravity of our little world, which seemed to be somewhere about the middle of the sphere, but rather nearer to myself than Cavor on account of my greater weight.
We must turn round and float back to back with the things between us.
It was the strangest sensation conceivable, floating thus loosely in space. At first, indeed, horribly strange. Then when the horror passed, not disagreeable at all, exceedingly restful. Indeed, the nearest thing in earthly experience to it that I know is lying on a very thick, very soft feather bed, the quality of utter detachment and independence. Well, I had not reckoned on a thing like this. I expected a violent jerk at starting, a giddy sense of speed. Instead, I felt as if I were disembodied. wasn't like the beginning of a journey. It was like the beginning of a dream. Oh, you know that sentence just absolutely made so many people be like, "Oh, it's just a dream." There were absolutely just a dream theorists about the first Men in the Moon when it originally came out. As soon as it was described as like, "Oh yes, it feels like the start of a dream," someone was like, "It's literally a dream. I knew it. I knew it the whole time. This is nonsense. This is a dream. I'm here for it." You know. I'm just picturing like a little book club hanging on every word of H.G. Wells's work, being so excited and having like this back and forth of like, no, 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 it must be a dream. We know this, this, and this mean that that's not possible. And someone else is like, no, 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 no. You just need to suspend your disbelief. When was the suspension of disbelief as a concept invented? That I need to know. Suspension of disbelief. Disbelief. Sometimes called willing suspension of disbelief. Ignoring certain pieces of things in a work of speculative fiction, in order to believe it for the sake of enjoyment. Aristotle first explored the idea of the concept in relation to its principles of theater. The audience ignores the unreality of fiction in order to experience catharsis. So absolutely, there could have been like little book clubs that were very excited about reading the latest H.G. Wells, and just kind of going like, no, 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 you need to suspend your disbelief about this. This is so much more entertaining if you don't start thinking about the scientific principles. Wells leaves them out so we can all enjoy ourselves type thing. You know, I can just picture it. People like there's like a small group of people sitting in like a little like fairly well appointed sitting room. They're all sitting around a little round table. There's a pot of tea sitting in the center of the table, and the little steam rising from the spout, and they're arguing, teacups in hand, trying not to gesticulate back and forth, like, no, 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 he states it's a dream. It's like, you're misremembering. It's just a very fun image to hold in one's mind. Anyway, now that I've gotten distracted, Chapter 5, The Journey to the Moon. Presently, Cavorite extinguished the light. He said that we had not overmuch energy stored, and that what we had we must economize for reading. For a time, whether it was long or short, I do not know, there was nothing but blank darkness. Oh, that's coming from there. Okay. Sorry, I needed to make sure that wasn't a leak dripping. I've had leaks in here before, and so I'm very vigilant about them. Anyway, nothing but blank darkness is where we were. A question floated up out of the void. How are we pointing? What's our direction?
We are flying away from the Earth at the tangent. As the moon is near her third corner, we'll be going somewhere towards her. I'll open a blind.
There came a click, and then a window in the outer case yawned open. The sky outside was as black as the darkness within the sphere, but the shape of the open window was marked by an infinite number of stars. Those who have only seen the starry sky from the earth cannot imagine its appearance when the vague, half-luminous veil of the air has been withdrawn. The stars we see on earth are the mere scattered survivors that penetrate our misty atmosphere. But now, at last, I could realize the meaning of the hosts of heaven. Stranger things we were presently to see but that airless, star-dusted sky. Of all things, I think that will be one of the last that I shall forget. The little window vanished with a click. Another beside it snapped open and instantly closed, and a third, and for a moment I had to close my eyes because of the blinding splendor of the waning moon. For a space I had to stare at Cavour and the white-lipped things about me to season my eyes to light again, before I could turn them toward that pallid glare. 4 windows were open, in order that the gravitation of the moon might act upon all the substances in our sphere. I found that I was no longer floating freely in space, that my feet were resting on the glass in the direction of the moon. The blankets and cases of provisions were also creeping slowly down the glass, and presently came to rest so as to block out a portion of the view. It seemed to me, of course, that I looked down when I looked at the moon. On Earth, down means earthward, the way things fall, and up the reverse direction. Now the pull of gravitation was toward the moon, and for all I knew, to the contrary, our Earth was overhead. And of course, when all the Cavorite blinds were closed, down was toward the center of our sphere and up toward its outer wall. It was curiously unlike earthly experience, too, to have light coming up to oneself. On Earth, light falls from above or slanting down sideways, but here it came from beneath our feet, and to see our shadows we had to look up. At first it gave me a sort of vertigo to stand only on thick glass and look down upon the moon through hundreds of thousands of miles of vacant space, but this sickness passed very speedily. Then, the splendor of the sight. The reader may imagine it best if he will lie on the ground some warm summer's night and look between their upraised feet at the moon. But for some reason, probably because the absence of air made it so much more luminous, the moon seemed already considerably larger than it does from Earth. The minutest details of its surface were acutely clear. And since we did not see it through air, its outline was bright and sharp. There was no glow or halo about it, and the stardust that covered the sky came right up to its very margin and peaked the outline of its unilluminated part. And as I stood and stared at the moon beneath my feet, the perception of that impossibility that had been with me on and off ever since our start returned again with tenfold conviction. Cavor, this takes to me clearly. Those companies we were going to run and all about the minerals?
Well,
I don't see them here.
no, but we'll get over all that.
Suppose I'm made to turn right side up again. Still, this... For a moment, I could half believe there never was a world.
A copy of Lloyd's News might help you.
I stared at the paper for a moment, then held it above the level of my face, found that I could read it quite easily. I struck a column of mean little advertisements. A gentleman of private means is willing to lend money, I read. And I knew that gentleman. Then somebody eccentric wanted to sell a cutaway bicycle, quite new and costing £15 for £5. And a lady in distress wished to dispose of some fish knives and forks, a wedding present, a great sacrifice. No doubt some simple soul was sagely examining these knives and forks, another triumphantly riding off on that bicycle, a third trustfully consulting that benevolent gentleman of means, even as I read. I laughed and let the paper drift from my hand. Are we visible from Earth?
Why?
I knew someone who was rather interested in astronomy. It occurred to me that it'd be rather odd if my friend chanced to be looking through some telescope.
It would need the most powerful telescope on Earth, even now, to see us as the minutest speck.
For a long time I stared in silence at the moon. It's a world. One feels that infinitely more than one ever did on Earth. With people, perhaps.
People? No, banish all that thought. Think of yourself as sort of an ultra-Arctic explorer, exploring the desolate places of space. Look at it.
He waved his hand at the shining whiteness below.
It's dead. Dead. Vast extinct volcanoes, lava wildernesses, tumbled wastes of snow, or frozen carbonic acid, or frozen air everywhere. Landslips, seams, cracks, gulfs. Nothing happens. Men have watched this planet systematically with telescopes for over 200 years. How much change do you think they've seen?
Well, none.
They've traced 2 indisputable landslips, a doubtful crack, and 1 slight periodic change of color. That's all.
I didn't even know they traced that.
No, yes, but as for people...
By the way, how small a thing will the biggest telescope show up on the moon?
One could see a fair-sized church. One could certainly see any towns or buildings or anything like the handiwork of men. There might perhaps be insects, something in the way of ants, for example, so they could hide in deep burrows from the lunar light, or some new sort of creature, having no earthly parallel. That's the most probable thing if we're to find life there at all. Think of the difference in conditions. Life must fit itself to a day as long as 14 earthly days, a cloudless sun blaze of 14 days, and then a night of equal length, growing ever colder and colder under these cold, sharp stars. In that night there must be cold, the ultimate cold, the absolute zero, 273 C below the earthly freezing point. Whatever life there is must hibernate through that and rise again each day.
He mused on this for a moment.
One can imagine something worm-like, taking its air solid as an earthworm swallows earth, or thick-skinned monsters.
By the by, speaking of monsters, why didn't we bring a gun? He didn't answer that question.
No, we'll just have to go. We'll see when we get there.
I remembered something else. Of course, there's my minerals anyhow. Whatever the conditions may be. Presently, he told me he wished to alter our course a little by letting the earth tug at us for a moment. He was going to open one earthward blind for 30 seconds. He warned me that it would make my head swim and advised me to extend my hands against the glass to break my fall. I did as he directed and thrust my feet against the bales of food cases and air cylinders to prevent their falling on me. Then, with a click, the window flew open. I fell clumsily upon my hands and face, and saw for a moment between my black extended fingers, our Mother Earth, a planet, and a downward sky. We were still very near. Cavorite told me the distance was perhaps 800 miles, and a huge terrestrial disk filled all our heaven. But already it was plain to see that the world was aglow. The land below us was in twilight and vague, but westward the vast gray stretches of the Atlantic shone like molten silver under the receding day. I think I recognized the cloud-dimmed coastlines of France, Spain, and the south of England. Then, with a click, the shutter closed again, and I found myself in a state of extraordinary confusion, sliding slowly over the smooth glass. When at last things settled themselves in my mind again, it seemed quite beyond question that the moon was down and under my feet, that the earth was somewhere away on the level of the horizon. The earth that had been down for me, my kindred, since the beginning of things. So slight were the exertions required of us, so easy did the practical annihilation of our weight make all we had to do, that the necessity for taking refreshment did not occur to us for nearly 6 hours, at least by Cavor's chronometer after our start. I was amazed at that lapse of time. Even then I was satisfied with very little. Cavor examined the apparatus for absorbing carbonic acid and water, and pronounced it to be in satisfactory order, with our consumption of oxygen having been extraordinarily slight. And, our talk being exhausting for the time, there being nothing further for us to do, we gave way to a curious drowsiness that had come upon us. And spreading our blankets on the bottom of the sphere in such a manner as to shut out most of the moonlight, we wished each other good night, and almost immediately fell asleep. And so, sleeping, and sometimes talking and reading a little, and at times eating, although without any keenness of appetite. Ooh, there's a footnote. Looking back for that again. Although without any keenness of appetite, but for the most part in a sort of quiescence that was neither waking nor slumber, we fell through a space of time that had neither day nor night in it, silently, softly, and swiftly down toward the moon. Anyway, the footnote, which was on the word appetite, has the following to say. It's a curious thing that while we were in the sphere, we felt not the slightest desire for food, nor did we feel the want of it when we abstained. At first, we forced our appetites, but afterward we fasted completely. Altogether, we did not consume 1/100th part of the compressed provisions we brought with us. The amount of carbonic acid we breathed was also unnaturally low, but why this was, I'm quite unable to explain. Alright, I think we've got time for, some big lightning. We've got time for one more chapter before the intermission, I think. I really like that this book kind of remains self-consistent, if not necessarily self-consistent with the science of the time. This was released in 1890s, early 1900s. Um, this it kind of remains self-consistent. It sets itself up a series of rules and sticks to them, and I think that's really satisfying. I think good science fiction, when it is not focused on interpersonal drama, and how people will react when being put in a very foreign and strange situation. I think science fiction is at its best when it has a set of rules that may or may not be confided to the viewer that it sticks to. It's especially true for like old science fiction like this, where the science is very old, and so it's all a bit out of date and wishy-washy to a modern listener or viewer. And so it makes it easier to keep track of things if everything is internally self-consistent. Anyway, let's dive into chapter 6, The Landing on the Moon. I remember how one day Cavour suddenly opened 6 of our shutters and blinded me so that I cried aloud at him. The whole area was moon, a stupendous scimitar of white dawn with its edge hacked out by notches of darkness, a crescent shore of an ebbing tide of darkness, out of which peaks and pinnacles came glittering into the blaze of the sun. I take it the reader has seen pictures or photographs of the moon, and that I need not describe the broader features of that landscape, those spacious ring-like ranges, vaster than any terrestrial mountains. Their summits shining in the day, their shadows harsh and deep, the grey, disordered plains, the ridges, hills, and craterlets, all passing, at last, from a blazing illumination into a common mystery of black. Athwart this world we were flying, scarcely 100 miles above its crests and pinnacles. And now we could see what no eye on earth will ever see, that under the blaze of day the harsh outlines of the rocks and ravines and the plains and the crater floor grew gray and indistinct under a thickening haze, and the white of their lit surfaces broke into lumps and patches, and broke again, and shrank and vanished, that here and there strange tints of brown and olive grew and spread. But little time we had for watching then, for it we now come to the real danger of our journey. We had to drop ever closer to the moon as we spun about it, to slacken our pace and watch our chance, till at last we could dare to drop upon its surface. For Cavour, that was a time of intense exertion, and for me it was an anxious inactivity. I seemed perpetually to be getting out of his way. We leapt about the sphere from point to point with an agility that would have been impossible on Earth. He was perpetually opening and closing the Cavorite windows, making calculations, consulting his chronometer by means of the glow lamp during those last eventful hours. For a long time we had all our windows closed, and hung silently in darkness, hurtling through space. Then he was feeling for the shutter studs, and suddenly 4 more windows had opened. I staggered and covered my eyes, drenched, scorched, blinded by the unaccustomed splendor of the sun beneath my feet. And again the shutters snapped, leaving my brain spinning in a darkness that pressed against the eyes. And after that I floated in another vast black silence. Then Cavour switched on the electric light, and he told me he proposed to bind all our luggage together with the blankets about it, against the concussion of our descent. We did this with our windows closed, because in that way our goods arranged themselves naturally at the center of the sphere. That too was a strange business, we 2 men floating loose in a spherical space, and packing and pulling ropes. Imagine, if you can, no up nor down, every effort resulting in unexpected movements. Now I'd be pressed against the glass with the full force of Cavour's thrust, and yet now I would be kicking helplessly in a void, and a star, the electric light, would be overhead, and underfoot, Cavour's feet would float up before my eyes, and we would be crossways to each other. But at last, But at last our goods were safely bound together in a big soft bale, all except 2 blankets with head holes that we were to wrap around ourselves. Then, for a flash, Cavor opened a window moonward, and we saw that we were dropping towards a huge central crater with a number of minor craters grouped in a sort of cross about it. And again Cavor flung our little sphere open to the scorching, blinding sun. I think he was using the sun's attraction as a brake. "Cover yourself with a blanket," he cried, thrusting himself from me, and for a moment I didn't understand. Then I hauled the blanket from beneath my face and got it about me and over my head and eyes. Abruptly, he closed the shutters again, snapped one open again, and closed it, and suddenly began snapping them all open, each safely into its steel roller. There came a jar, and then we were rolling, over and over, bumping against the glass and against the big bale of luggage, clutching at each other, and outside some white substance splashed, as if we were rolling down a slope of snow. Over, clutch, bump, over, clutch, bump, and over again. There came a thud, and I was half buried under the veil of our possessions. For a space, everything was still. And I could hear Cavor puffing and grunting, and the snapping of a shutter in its sash. I made an effort, then thrust back our blanket-wrapped luggage, and emerged from beneath. Our open windows were just as visible as a deeper black. Our open windows were just visible as a deeper black set with stars. We were still alive, and we were lying in the darkness of the shadow of the wall of the great crater into which we had fallen. We sat, getting our breath again, and feeling the bruises on our limbs. I don't think either of us had a very close expectation of such rough handling as we had received. I struggled painfully to my feet. "And now to look at the landscape of the moon," said I. "But it's tremendously dark," Cavor. The glass was dewy, and as I spoke I wiped at it with my blanket. We're half an hour or so beyond the day. We must wait." It was impossible to distinguish anything. We might have been in a sphere for steel that all we could see. My rubbing with the blanket simply smeared the glass, and as fast as I wiped it, it became opaque again with freshly condensed moisture mixed with an increasing quantity of blanket hairs. Of course, I ought not to have used the blanket. In my efforts to clear the glass, I slipped upon the damp surface and hurt my shin against one of the oxygen cylinders that protruded from our bale. The thing was a disaster. It was absurd. Here we had just arrived upon the moon, amidst we knew not what wonders, and all we could see was the gray and the streaming wall of the bubble in which we had come. Confound it, we might as well stayed at home at this rate. And I squatted on the bale and shivered, drawing my blanket closer about me. Abruptly, the moisture turned to spangles and fronds of frost.
"Can you reach the electric heater?" "Yes, that black knob, or we'll all freeze."
I did not wait to be told twice. And now what to do?
"Wait."
Wait?
"Of course. We'll have to wait until the air gets warm again and the glass will clear. We can't do anything till then. It's night here still. We have to wait for the day to overtake us. Well, don't you feel hungry?"
For a space I didn't answer him, but sat fretting. I turned reluctantly from the smeared, puzzled glass and stared at his face. Yes, I am hungry. I feel somehow enormously disappointed. I had expected, well, I don't know what I had expected, but not this. I summoned my philosophy and, rearranging my blanket about me, sat down on the bale again and began my first meal on the moon. I don't think I've finished it. I forget. Presently, first in patches, then running rapidly together into wider spaces, came the clearing of the glass, that drawing a misty veil that hid the moon world from our eyes. And we peered out upon the landscape of the moon. Alright, folks. We are about at 2 hours, so I think this is a good spot to call for an intermission. We will be right back. Now is a stellar time for you to get up, stretch your legs if you've been sitting along with me, pet your animals if you've got them around. Definitely take some drinks of water. We have been running into H.G. Wells' favorite words much less than I thought we were going to. And so I fully expected to have completely emptied this, but I have not. So definitely hydrate. It's very important that you keep hydrated. Now would be a good time to prep some little snackies if you're feeling that sort of way. Just take care of everything and anything. If you've got some medication you need to take, here's your reminder. But we'll be back as soon as possible. It'll be about 15 minutes. One of those projects I've been working on the back burner is a timer. Is a timer, so we all know how long those 15 minutes are when I'm up and wandering around. You all cannot hear the rain sounds that are happening. So I would leave the mic on to let you listen to the rain, but you all can't hear it. So I'll be back in about 15 minutes at the longest. Keep one eye on the stream because I am known to come back early, and I've been known to come back late every now and again. Either way, enjoy the BRB, everyone. We will be right back. It's okay, library. Alright. Coax the library out from under the couch. Let us hope more thunder does not chase him back under. I'm thinking about replacing this, what's the word I'm looking for? This space background? I really like this space background. I think it's really cute. I really enjoy it. I think it's very fun, but, like, I've been thinking about, like, just kind of replacing it with something. You know, it's been here for a long time, and it kind of does the same basic thing over and over. Even not necessarily just replacing it outright, but just changing the way it works. It's been kind of the same slow space spin the whole time. Maybe setting it up to have a little bit more of a randomness in its generated cycles would be really nice. But that's all theory. Whether it will actually reach practice is another story. Just make sure I've got my little chat control open here. Don't want to not have that available to me. Kind of room. Yeah. No one loved him, do they? Nobody never loved the poor kitty. Oh, that's interesting. So something about the way I designed the snowflakes to randomize every time the page loads, took up enough whatnots to make the cup starter. That's actually kind of interesting. That must mean the cup has a lot going on. I mean, I guess it makes sense. It's kind of simulating real-time physics for each of those small bodies. So I follow. Kind of makes sense. I definitely need to. I thought I had it set up so that the snowflakes do not have a rolling border any longer. Live. Oop, that's the wrong one. I shouldn't be fussing with that live, but I fixed the problem. Yeah, I don't know. I've been thinking about changing things up a little. What the heck? Why did the scroll bars come back? Oh, come on. Really? Did I? Dang. Anyway, I will fuss with this later. Let's get back to the book, shall we? Yeah. Sorry, the little scroll bars kind of make it. Kind of break the illusion a little bit and remind you that yes, that is a little web page hiding behind the book. That's how that works. Surprise.
local web developer actually uses his web development skills for something other than website shopping. Uh, anyway, I've gotten very distracted over the course of the BRB. Library is very comfy. Well, he's in the process of getting very comfy. He's got some little needs to get out. Let's dive back in with chapter 7, Sunrise on the Moon. As we saw it first, it was the wildest and most desolate of scenes. We were in an enormous amphitheater, a vast circular plain, the floor of the giant crater. Its cliff-like walls closed in on us on every side. From the westward, the light of the unseen sun fell upon them, reaching to the very foot of the cliff, and showed a disordered escarpment of drab and grayish rock, lined here and there with banks and crevices of snow. It was perhaps a dozen miles away, but at first no intervening atmosphere diminished in the slightest the minutely detailed brilliancy with which these things glared at us. They stood out clear and dazzling against the background of starry blackness that seemed to our earthly eyes rather a gloriously spangled velvet curtain in the spaciousness of the sky. The eastward cliff was at first merely a starless selvedge, with a starry dome. No rosy flush, no creeping pallor announced the commencing day. Only the corona, the zodiacal light, a huge cone-shaped luminous haze pointing up toward the splendor of the morning star, warned us of the imminent nearness of the sun. Whatever light was about us was reflected by the westward cliffs. It showed a huge, undulating plain, cold and gray, a gray that deepened eastward into the absolute raven darkness of the cliff shadow. Innumerable rounded gray summits, ghostly hummocks, billows of snowy substance, stretching crest beyond crest, into the remote obscurity, gave us our first inkling of the distance of the crater wall. These hummocks looked like snow. At first I thought they were snow, but they were not. They were mounds and masses of frozen air. So it was at first. Then sudden, swift, and amazing came the lunar day. The sunlight had crept down the cliff. It touched the drifted masses at its base, and incontinently came striding with 7-leagued boots towards us. The distant cliff seemed to shift and quiver, and a touch of the dawn, a reek of gray vapor poured upward from the crater floor, whirls and puffs and drifting wraiths of gray, thicker and broader and denser, until at last the whole westward plain was steaming like a wet handkerchief held before the fire, and the westward cliffs were no more than a refracted glare beyond.
It is air. It must be air, or it wouldn't rise like this at the mere touch of a sunbeam. Look at this pace.
He peered upwards.
Look at that. What? Look at the sky. Already. Out in the blackness, and a little touch of blue. See, the stars seem larger. All the little ones and all those dim nebulosities we saw in empty space, they are hiding.
Swiftly, steadily, the day approached us. Gray summit after gray summit was overtaken by the blaze and turned to a smoking white intensity. At last there was nothing to the west of us but a bank of surging fog, a tumultuous advance and ascent of cloudy haze. The distant cliff had receded farther and farther, and loomed and charged through the whirl, and foundered and vanished at last in its confusion. Nearer came the steaming advance, nearer and nearer, coming as fast as the shadow of a cloud before the southwest wind. About us rose a thin anticipatory haze. Cavorite gripped my arm.
What? Look, the sunrise, the sun.
He turned me about and pointed toward the brow of the eastward cliff, looming above the haze about us, scarce lighter than the darkness of the sky. But now its line was marked by strange reddish shapes, tongues of vermilion flame that writhed and danced.
I fancied it must be spiraling vapor that had caught the light and made this crest of fiery tongues against the sky, but indeed it was the solar prominences I saw, a crown of fire about the sun that is forever hidden from earthly eyes by our atmospheric veil. And then, sun. Steadily, inevitably, came a brilliant line, came a thin edge of intolerable effulgence that took a circular shape, became a bow, became a blazing scepter, and hurled a shaft of heat at us, as though it was a sphere, as though it was a spear. It is a sphere. It seems to be a spear. It seemed verily to stab my eyes. I cried aloud and turned about blinded, groping for my blanket beneath the veil. And with that incandescence came a sound, the first sound that had reached us from without since we left the earth. A hissing and rustling, a stormy trailing of the aerial garment of the advancing day. And with the coming of the sound and the light, the sphere lurched, blinded and dazzled. We staggered helplessly against each other. It lurched again, and the hissing grew louder. I had shut my eyes perforce. I was making clumsy efforts to cover my head with my blanket, and this second lurch sent me helplessly off my feet. I fell against the veil, and opening my eyes had a momentary glimpse of the air just outside our glass. It was running, it was boiling, like snow into which a white-hot rod is thrust. What had been solid air was suddenly, at the touch of the sun, become a paste, a mud, a slushy liquefaction, that hissed and bubbled into gas. There came a still more violent whirl of the sphere, and we had clutched one another. In another moment, we were sped around again. Round we went over and over, then I was on all fours. The lunar dawn had hold of us. It meant to show us little men what the moon could do with us. I caught a second glimpse of things without. Puffs of vapor, half-liquid slush, excavated, sliding, falling, and sliding further. We drooped into darkness. I went down with Cavor's knees in my chest. Then he seemed to fly away from me, and for a moment I lay with all the breath out of my body, staring upward. A toppling crag of the melting stuff had splashed over us, buried us, and now it thinned and boiled off of us. I saw the bubbles dancing on the glass above, and I heard Cavor exclaiming feebly. Then some huge landslip in the thawing air had caught us, and spluttering expostulation, we began to roll down a slope, rolling faster and faster, leaping crevasses and rebounding from banks, faster and faster westward, into the white-hot boiling tumult of the lunar day. Clutching at one another, we spun about, pitched this way and that, our bale of packages leaping at us, pounding us. We collided, we gripped, we were torn asunder. Our heads met, and the whole universe burst into fiery darts and stars. On the earth, we should have smashed one another a dozen times, but on the moon, luckily for us, our weight was only 1/6 of what it is terrestrially, and we fell very mercifully. I recall the sensation of utter sickness, a feeling as if my brain were upside down within my skull, and then something was at work upon my face, some thin feelers worrying my ears. Then I discovered the brilliance of the landscape around was mitigated by blue spectacles. Cavor bent over me, and I saw his face upside down, his eyes also protected by these tinted goggles. His breath came irregularly, and his lip was bleeding from a bruise.
Better?
He said, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. Everything seemed to sway for a space, but that was simply my giddiness. I perceived that he had closed some of the shutters to the outer sphere to save me from the direct blaze of the sun. I was aware that everything about us was very brilliant. That's for a space, folks. Drink time, baby. Heck yeah, I'm sipping that ferocious hydration, my dude. Anyway, Lord, but this
I craned my neck to see. I perceived that there was a blinding glare outside, an utter change from the gloomy darkness of our first impression. Have I been insensible long?
I don't know. The chronometer's broken. Some little time. Oh, my dear chap, I've been afraid.
I lay for a space, taking this in. I saw his face still bore evidences of emotion. For a while I said nothing. I passed an inquisitive hand over my contusions and surveyed his face for similar damage. The back of my right hand had suffered the most and was skinless and raw. My forehead was bruised and had bled. He handed me a little measure with some of the restorative, I forget the name of it, that he'd brought with us. After a time I felt a little better. I began to stretch my limbs carefully, and soon I could talk. Well, it wouldn't have done, I said, as if there had been no interval.
No, it wouldn't.
He thought, his hands hanging over his knees. He peered through the glass and stared at me.
Lord, no.
What's happened? Have we jumped to the tropics?
It was as I expected. The air has evaporated. Well, if it is air. At any rate, it's evaporated and the surface of the moon is showing. We're lying on a bank of earthy rock. Here and there, bare soil is exposed. It's such a queer sort of soil.
It occurred to him that it was unnecessary to explain. He assisted me into a sitting position. I could see it with my own eyes. Okay. Oh, was I not petting you right? Oh, has the library had his fill of pets for a little bit? I see. That'd be a fun channel point redeem. If one of the cats is on screen, try and get me to brush them. Oh, library does not like that idea. Look at his little tail.
He's like, no. Do not let the chat brush me. Completely disallowed.
Yeah. Well, you stay comfy. Anyway, chapter 8. A Lunar Morning. The harsh emphasis, the pitiless black and white of the scenery had altogether disappeared. The glare of the sun had taken upon itself a faint tinge of amber. The shadows upon the cliff of the crater wall were deeply purple. To the eastward, a dark bank of fog still crouched and sheltered from the sunrise, but to the westward the sky was blue and clear. I began to realize the length of my insensibility. We were no longer in a void. An atmosphere had risen around us. The outline of things had gained in character, grown acute and varied, save for a shallowed space of white substance here and there. White substance was no longer air, but snow. The Arctic appearance had gone altogether. Everywhere, broad, rusty brown spaces of bare and tumbled earth spread to the blaze of the sun. Here and there, at the edge of the snowdrifts, were transient little pools and eddies of water, the only things stirring in that expanse of bareness. The sunlight inundated the upper two blinds of our sphere and turned our climate to a high summer, but our feet were still in shadow, and the sphere was lying upon a drift of snow. And scattered here and there upon the slope, and emphasized by little white threads of unthawed snow now upon their shady sides, were shapes like sticks, dry, twisted sticks, of the same rusty hue as the rock upon which they lay. That caught one's thoughts sharply. Sticks? On a lifeless world? Then, as my eye grew more accustomed to the texture of their substance, I perceived that almost all this surface had a fibrous texture, like a carpet of brown needles that one finds beneath the shade of a pine tree. Cavor,
Yes?
it may be a dead world now, but once, I trailed off, something arresting my attention. I discovered among these needles a number of little round objects, and it seemed to me that one of these had moved. Cavor, I whispered,
What?
but I did not answer at once. I stared incredulously. For an instant I could not believe my eyes. I gave an inarticulate cry, and I gripped his arm to point.
Look.
I said, finding my tongue.
Yes.
And there, and yes, and there, and there.
His eyes followed my pointing finger.
Eh?
How can I describe the thing I saw? It was so petty a thing to state, yet it seemed so wonderful, so pregnant with emotion. I've said that amidst the stick-like litter were these rounded bodies, these little oval bodies that might have passed as very small pebbles. And now first one and then another had stirred, and rolled over and crackled, and each down the crack of them showed a minute line of yellowish green, thrusting outward to meet the hot encouragement of the newly risen sun. For a moment that was all. Then there stirred and burst a third.
It's a seed,
Said Cavor. Then I heard him whisper very softly,
life. Life.
and immediately it poured upon us that our vast journey had not been made in vain, that we'd come to no arid waste of minerals, but to a world that lived and moved. We watched intensely. I remember I kept rubbing the glass before me with my sleeve, jealous at the faintest suspicion of mist. The picture was clear and vivid only in the middle of the field. All about that center, the dead fibers and seeds were magnified and distorted by the curvature of the glass. But we could see well enough. One after another, all down the sunlit slope, these miraculous little brown bodies burst and gaped apart like seed pods, like the husks of fruits, opened eager mouths that drank in the heat and light pouring in a cascade from the newly risen sun. Every moment more of these seed coats ruptured, and even as they did so, the swelling pioneers overflowed their rent distended seed cases and passed into the second stage of growth. With a steady assurance, a swift deliberation, these amazing seeds thrust a rootlet downward into the earth, and a queer little bundle, like a bud, was thrown into the air. In a little while, the whole slope was dotted with minute plantlets standing at attention in the blaze of the sun. They didn't stand for long. The bundle-like buds swelled and strained and opened with a jerk, thrusting out a coronet of little sharp tips, spreading a whorl of tiny, brownish leaves that lengthened rapidly, lengthened visibly even as we watched. The movement was slower than any animal's, but swifter than any plants I've ever seen before. How can I suggest it to you? The way that growth went on, the leaf tips grew so that they moved onward even while we looked at them. The brown seed case shriveled and was absorbed with an equal rapidity. Have you ever, on a cold day, taken a thermometer in your warm hand and watched the little thread of mercury creep up the tube? These moon plants, they grew like that. In a few minutes, I can speak English. Sorry, I got distracted by making sure chat wasn't on fire. In a few minutes, as it seemed, the buds of the more forward of these plants had lengthened into a stem and were even putting forth a second whorl of leaves, and all the slope that seemed so recently a lifeless stretch of litter was now dark with the stunted olive-green herbage of bristling spikes that swayed with the vigor of their growing. I turned about, and behold, along the upper edge of a rock, to the eastward, a similar fringe, in a scarcely less forward condition, swayed and bent, dark against the blinding glare of the sun. And beyond this fringe was the silhouette of a plant mass, branching clumsily like a cactus, and swelling visibly, swelling like a bladder that fills with air. Then, to the westward, also I discovered that another such distended form was rising over the scrub. But here the light fell upon its sleek sides. I could see that its color was a vivid orange hue. It rose as one watched it. If one looked away from it for a minute and then back, its outline had changed. It thrust out blunt, congested branches until in a little time it rose a coralline shape of many feet in height.
Compared with such a growth, the terrestrial puffball, which will sometimes swell a foot in diameter in a single night, would be a hopeless laggard. But then the puffball grows against a gravitational pull 6 times that of the moon. Beyond, out of gullies and flats that had been hidden from us, but not from the quickening sun, over reefs and banks of shining rock, a bristling beard of spiky and fleshy vegetation was straining into view, hurrying tumultuously to take advantage of the brief day in which it must flower and fruit and seed again and die. I'm going to count tumultuously as tumult. Let's take a drink, everybody. Sippy. Heck yeah, get that water. Tumultuous. It was like a miracle, that growth. So one must imagine the trees and plants arose at creation and covered the desolation of the new-made earth. Imagine it. Imagine that dawn. Resurrection of the frozen air, the stirring and quickening of the soil, then this silent uprising of vegetation, this unearthly ascent of fleshiness and spikes. Conceive it all lit by a blaze that would make the intensest sunlight of earth seem watery and weak. And still around this stirring jungle, wherever there was shadow, lingered banks of bluish snow. And to have the picture of our impression complete, you must bear in mind that we saw it all through a thick bent glass, distorting it as things are distorted by a lens, acute only in the center of the picture, and very bright there, and toward the edges magnified and unreal. Chapter 9. Prospecting begins. We ceased to gaze. We turned to each other, the same thought, the same question in our eyes. For these plants to grow, there must also be some air, however attenuated, air that we should also be able to breathe. The manhole?
Yes, if it is air, we see.
In a little while, these plants will be. These plants will be as high as we are. Suppose after all, is it certain? How do you know that stuff is air? It might be nitrogen. It may be carbonic acid, even. For a little context, carbonic acid is what we would now refer to as CO2, carbon dioxide, I assume. Let me fact check myself here real quick, just to make sure. Carbonic acid is carbonic acid CO2. Carbonic acid, H2CO3, is a compound of the elements hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. It is formed in small amounts when its anhydride, carbon dioxide, dissolves in water. Okay, so it is adjacent to carbon. So when they are referring to carbonic acid, they are referring to it. They are referring to what is produced when you essentially bubble CO2 through water. So my assumption is when they refer to carbonic acid, that's probably what we describe as carbon dioxide in air. Just because there's so much humidity in the air, it is likely to produce carbonic acid. Either way, they're adjacent enough. Keep in mind when they refer to carbonic acid, they probably refer to what we are exhaling. That or I could be wrong. I'm happy to be wrong about this. Post me some comments about it. Say things in chat. Anyway, maybe carbonic acid even is where we were.
Now that's easy.
And he set about proving it. He produced a big piece of crumpled paper from the bale, lit it, and thrust it hastily through the manhole valve. I bent forward and peered through that thick glass for its appearance outside, that little flame on whose evidence depended so much. I saw the paper drop out and lie lightly upon the snow. The pink flame of its burning vanished. For an instant it seemed to be extinguished, then I saw a little blue tongue upon the edge of it that trembled and crept and spread. Quietly, the whole sheet, save where it lay in immediate contact with the snow, charred and shriveled and sent up a quivering thread of smoke. There was no doubt left to me. The atmosphere of the moon was either pure oxygen or air, and capable, therefore, unless its tenuity was excessive, of supporting our alien life. We might emerge and live. I sat down with my legs on either side of the manhole and prepared to unscrew it, but Cavor stopped me. There is first a little precaution. He pointed out that although it was certainly an oxygenated atmosphere outside, it might be still so rarefied as to cause us grave injury. He reminded me of mountain sickness and of the bleeding that often afflicts aeronauts who have ascended too swiftly, and he spent some time in the preparation of a sickly-tasting drink which he insisted on my sharing. It made me feel a little numb, but otherwise had no effect on me. Then he permitted me to begin unscrewing the cap. Presently, the glass stopper of the manhole was so far undone that the denser air within our sphere began to escape along the thread of the screw, singing as a kettle sings before it boils. Thereupon he made me desist. It speedily became evident that the pressure outside was very much less than it was within. How much less, we had no means of telling. I sat grasping the stopper with both hands, ready to close it again if, in spite of our intense hope, the lunar atmosphere should, after all, prove too rarefied for us, and Cavor sat with a cylinder of compressed oxygen at hand to restore our pressure. We looked at one another in silence, then at the fantastic vegetation that swayed and grew visibly and noiselessly without. And ever that shrill piping continued. My blood vessels began to throb in my ears, and the sound of Cavor's movements diminished. I noted how still everything had become because of the thinning of the air. As our air sizzled out from the screw, the moisture of it condensed in little puffs. Presently I experienced a peculiar shortness of breath that lasted, indeed, during the whole of our time of our exposure to the moon's exterior atmosphere, in a rather unpleasant sensation about the ears and the fingernails and the back of the throat grew upon my attention and presently passed off again. But then came a horrible vertigo and nausea that abruptly changed the quality of my courage. I gave the lid of the manhole half a turn, made a handy explanation to Cavor, but now he was the more sanguine. He answered me in a voice that seemed extraordinarily small and remote because of the thinness of the air that carried the sound. He recommended a nip of brandy and set me the example, and presently I felt better. I turned the manhole stopper back again. The throbbing in my ears grew louder, then I remarked that the piping note of the outrush had ceased. For a time I could not be sure that it had ceased. "Well," said Cavor in the ghost of a voice. "Well,
Shall we go on?
is this all?"
If you can stand it."
By way of answer, I went on unscrewing. I lifted the circular operculum from its place and laid it carefully on the bale. A flake or so of snow whirled and vanished as that thin and unfamiliar air took possession of our sphere. I knelt and then seated myself at the edge of the manhole and peered over it. Beneath, within a yard of my face, lay the untrodden snow of the moon. There came a little pause. Our eyes met.
"It doesn't distress your lungs too much?"
"No, I can handle this." He stretched out his hand for his blanket and thrust his head through its central hole and wrapped it about him. He came down on the edge of the manhole, let his feet drop until they were within 6 inches of the lunar ground, hesitated for a moment, and then thrust himself forward, dropped those intervening inches, and stood upon the untrodden soil of the moon. As he stepped forward, he was refracted grotesquely by the edge of the glass. He stood for a moment, looking this way and that. Then he drew himself together and leapt. The glass distorted everything, but it seemed to me even then to be an extremely big leap. He had at one bound become remote. He
seemed 20 or 30 feet off. He was standing high upon a rocky mass and gesticulating back to me. Perhaps he was shouting, but the sound didn't reach me. But how the deuce had he done this? I felt like a man who had just seen a new conjuring trick. In a puzzled state of mind, I too dropped through the manhole. I stood up. Just in front of me, the snowdrift had fallen away and made a sort of ditch. I made a step and jumped. I found myself flying through the air, saw the rock on which he stood coming to meet me, clutched it, and clung in a state of infinite amazement. I gasped a painful laugh. I was tremendously confused. Cavor bent down and shouted in piping tones for me to be careful. I had forgotten that on the moon, with only an eighth part of the Earth's mass and a quarter of its diameter, my weight was now scarcely a sixth of what it was on Earth. But now that fact insisted on being remembered.
We are out of Mother Earth's leading strings now.
With a guarded effort, I raised myself to the top, and moving as cautiously as a rheumatic patient, stood up beside him under the blaze of the sun. The sphere lay behind us on its dwindling snowdrift 30 feet away. As far as the eye could see over the enormous disorder of rocks that formed the crater floor, the same bristling scrub that surrounded us was starting into life, diversified here and there by bulging masses of a cactus form, and scarlet and purple lichens that grew so fast they seemed to crawl over the rocks. The whole area of the crater seemed to me then to be one similar wilderness up to the very foot of the surrounding cliff. This cliff was apparently bare of vegetation, save at its base, and with buttresses and terraces and platforms that did not very greatly attract our attention at the time. It was many miles away from us in every direction. We seemed to be almost at the center of the crater, and we saw it through a certain haziness that drove before the wind. For there was even a wind now in this thin air, a swift yet weak wind that chilled exceedingly but exerted little pressure. It was blowing round the crater, as it seemed, to the hot illuminated side from the foggy darkness under the sunward wall. It was difficult to look into this eastward fog. We had to peer with half-closed eyes beneath the shade of our hands because of the fierce intensity of this motionless sun.
It seems to be deserted. Absolutely desolate, said Cavor.
I looked about me again. I retained, even then, a clinging hope of some quasi-human evidence, some pinnacle of a building, some house or engine, but everywhere one looked, there spread the tumbled rocks and peaks and crests, and the darting scrub and those bulging cacti that swelled and swelled, a flat negation, as it seemed, of all such hopes. It looks as though those plants had it to themselves. I don't see any trace of any other creature.
No insects, no birds, no, not a trace, nor scrap, nor particle of animal life. If there was, well, what would they do in the night? No. There's just these plants alone.
I shaded my eyes with my hand. It's like the landscape of a dream. These things are less like earthly land plants than the things one imagines at the bottom of the sea. Look at that, yonder. One might imagine it a lizard changed into a plant, and glare.
This is only the fresh morning.
He sighed and looked about him.
This is no world for men, and yet in a way it's appealing.
He became silent for a time, then commenced his meditative humming. I started at a gentle touch, and found that a thin sheet of livid lichen was lapping over my shoe. I kicked at it, and it fell to powder, and each speck began to grow. I heard Cavor exclaim sharply, and perceived that one of the fixed bayonets of the scrub had pricked him. He hesitated, his eyes seeking among the rocks about us. A sudden blaze of pink had crept up a ragged pillar of crag. It was a most extraordinary pink, a livid magenta. "Look!" said I, turning, and behold, Cavor had vanished. For an instant I stood transfixed. Then I made a hasty step over to look on the verge of the rock. But in my surprise at his disappearance, I once more forgot that we were on the moon. The thrust of my foot that I made in striding would have carried me a yard on earth. On the moon it carried me 6, a good 5 yards over the edge. For the moment the thing had something of the effect of those nightmares when one falls and falls. For a while one falls 16 feet in the first second of a fall on earth. On the moon one falls 2, and with only a sixth of one's weight. I fell, or rather I jumped down, about 10 yards, I suppose. It seemed to take quite a long time, 5 or 6 seconds, give or take. I floated through the air and fell like a feather, knee-deep in a snowdrift at the bottom of a gully of blue-white veined rock, and looked about me. "Cavor?" I cried, but no Cavor was visible. "Cavor!" I cried louder, and the rocks echoed me. I turned fiercely to the rocks and clambered to the summit of them. "Cavor!" I cried. My voice sounded like the voice of a lost lamb. The sphere, too, was not in sight, and for a moment a horrible feeling of desolation pinched at my heart. Then I saw him. He was laughing and gesticulating to attract my attention. He was on a bare patch of rock 20 or 30 yards away. I couldn't hear his voice, but jump, said his gestures. I hesitated. The distance seemed enormous, but I reflected that surely I must be able to clear a greater distance than Cavor. I made a step back, gathered myself together, and leapt with all my might. I seemed to shoot right up in the air, as though I should never come down. It was horrible and delightful, and as wild as a nightmare to go flying off in this fashion. I realized that my leap had been altogether too violent. I flew clean over Cavor's head, and beheld a spiky confusion in a gully, spreading to meet my fall. I gave a yelp of alarm, and put my hands out, and straightened my legs. I hit a huge fungoid bulk that burst all about me, scattering a mass of orange spores in every direction, and covering me with orange powder. I rolled over, spluttering, and came to rest, convulsed with breathless laughter. I became aware of Cavor's little round face peering over a bristling hedge. He shouted some fading enquiry. "Eh?" I tried to shout, but this would not do for want of breath. He made his way toward me, coming gingerly among the bushes.
"We've got to be careful. This moon has no discipline. She'll let us smash ourselves."
He helped me to my feet.
"You exerted yourself too much,"
he said, dabbing at the yellow stuff with his hand to try and remove it from my garments. I stood passive and panting, allowing him to beat off the jelly from my knees and elbows and lecture me upon my misfortunes.
"We don't quite allow for gravitation. Our muscles are scarcely educated yet. We must practice a little, when you've got your breath, that is."
I pulled 2 or 3 little thorns out of my hand, and sat for a time on a boulder of rock. My muscles were quivering, and that feeling of personal disillusionment that comes at the first fall to the learner of crying on earth. It suddenly occurred to Cavor that the cold air in the gully, after the brightness of the sun, might give me a fever, so we clambered back into the sunlight. Found that beyond a few abrasions, I had received no serious injuries from my tumble, and Cavor's suggestion that we were presently
looking round for some safe and easy landing place for my next leap. We chose a rocky slab some... Ow, library, that is my leg. We chose a rocky slab some 10 yards off, separated from us by a little thicket of olive green spikes.
Imagine it there,
Said Cavor, who was assuming the airs of a trainer, and he pointed to a spot about 4 feet from my toes. This leap I managed without difficulty, and I must confess I found a certain satisfaction in Cavor's falling short by a foot or so and tasting the spikes of the scrub.
One has to be careful, you see,
He said, pulling out his thorns, and with that he ceased to be my mentor and became my fellow learner in the art of lunar locomotion. We chose a still easier jump and did it without difficulty, then leapt back again, to and fro several times, accustoming our muscles to the new standard. I could never have believed, had I not experienced it myself, how rapid the adaptation would be. In a very little time, indeed, certainly after fewer than 30 leaps, we could judge the effort necessary for a distance with almost terrestrial assistance. Or almost terrestrial assurance, rather. I was like, terrestrial assistance doesn't make sense there, because it's assurance. I can read. And all this time, the lunar plants were growing around us, higher and denser, more entangled every moment, thicker and taller, spiked plants, green cactus masses, fungi, fleshy and lichenous things, strangeness radiating sinuous shapes. But we were so intent upon our leaping that for a time we gave no heed to their unfaltering expansion. An extraordinary elation had taken possession of us. Partly, I think, it was our sense of release from the confinement of the sphere. Mainly, however, the thin sweetness of the air, which I am certain contained a much larger proportion of oxygen than our terrestrial atmosphere. In spite of the strange quality of everything about us, I felt as adventurous and experimental as a Cockney would do, placed for the first time among mountains, and I do not think it occurred to either of us, face to face though we were with the unknown, to be greatly afraid. We were bitten by a spirit of enterprise. We selected a lichenous kopje, perhaps 15 yards away, and landed on its summit, one after the other.
Good, we cried to each other. Good.
And Cavor made 3 steps and went off to a tempting slope of snow, a good 20 yards and more beyond. I stood for a moment, struck by the grotesque effect of the soaring figure, his dirty cricket cap and spiky hair, his little round body, his arms, and his knickerbockered legs tucked up tightly against the weird spaciousness of the lunar scene. A gust of laughter seized me, and then I stepped off to follow. Plump! I dropped beside him. We made a few gargantuan strides, leapt 3 or 4 times more, and sat down at last in a lichenous hollow. Our lungs were painful. We sat holding our sides and recovering our breath, looking appreciation to one another. Cavor panted something about amazing sensations, and then came a thought into my head. For the moment, it did not seem a particular appalling a thought, simply a natural question arising out of the situation. By the way, where exactly is the sphere?
Eh?
Cavor looked at me, and the full meaning of what we were saying struck me sharply. Cavor, I cried, landing a hand on his arm. Where's the sphere? Drake, where's the door hole? You know? Oh. Sorry, we haven't caught a lot of
a lot of Wells's favorite words this evening, so I'm finding that I still have to drink between chapters. Usually when I have a Wells book going and we have the drinking game going, I'm just constantly downing water. Maybe it was just those short stories we were reading last time that made them very sip worthy. And now that he's being a bit more verbose, he's picking different words. Could be, could be. Either I'm reading very quickly tonight, or these are short chapters, because we've still got a good ways left, and we're already on chapter 10, when usually I tend to make 8 chapters a night. Anyway, chapter 10, Lost Men in the Moon. His face caught something of my dismay. He stood up and stared about him at the scrub that fenced us in and rose about us, straining upward in a passion of growth. He put a dubious hand to his lips and spoke with a sudden lack of assurance.
I think we left it somewhere about there?
He pointed a hesitating finger that wavered in an arc.
I'm not sure.
His look of consternation deepened.
Anyhow, it can't be too far.
We had both stood up by this point. We made unmeaning ejaculations. Our eyes sought in the twining, thickening jungle round about us. All about us on the sunlit slopes frothed and swayed the darting shrubs, the swelling cactus, the creeping lichens, and wherever the shade remained, the snowdrifts lingered. North, south, east, and west were spread an identical monotony of unfamiliar forms. And somewhere, buried already among this tangled confusion, was our sphere, our home, our only provision, our only hope. Our only hope of escape from this fantastic wilderness of ephemeral growths into which we had come. Sorry, I defaulted to just our only hope, and then I looked up and there was more sense.
I think, after all, he said, pointing suddenly, it might be over there.
No, we've turned in a curve. See, here's the mark of my heels. It's clear the thing must be more to the eastward, much more. Now the sphere must be over there.
I think I kept the sun upon my right all the time.
Every leap, it seems to me, my shadow flew before me. We stared into one another's eyes. The area of the crater had become enormously vast to our imaginations, the growing thickets already impenetrably dense. Good heavens, what fools we've been!
It's evident that we must find it again, and that soon. The sun grows stronger. We should be fainting with the heat already if it wasn't so dry, and, well, I'm hungry.
I stared at him. I hadn't suspected this aspect of the matter before, but it came to me at once. Positive craving. Yes, I said with emphasis. I'm hungry too. Also, there goes Library. There was a little thunder, and now he's hiding under the couch. You know, Bubs, you could hide on the bed.
No. I need to be enclosed.
Well, there are better places for you to be enclosed than under the couch, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Anyway, as calmly as possible, we surveyed the interminable reefs and thickets that formed the floor of the crater, each of us weighing in silence the chances of our finding the sphere before we were overtaken by heat and hunger.
It can't be 50 yards from here, said Cavor with indecisive gestures. The only thing is to beat round about until we come upon it.
That is all we can do, I said without any alacrity to begin our hunt. I wish this confounded spike bush did not grow so quickly.
That's just it, but it was lying on a bank of snow.
I stared about me in the vain hope of recognizing some knoll or shrub that had been near the sphere, but everywhere was a confusing sameness. Everywhere the aspiring bushes, the distending fungi, the dwindling snowbanks steadily and inevitably changed. The sun scorched and stung, the faintness
of an unaccountable hunger mingled with our infinite perplexity. And even as we stood there, confused and lost amidst unprecedented things, we became aware for the first time of a sound upon the moon, other than the air of the growing plants, the faint sighing of the wind, or anything we had made. Boom, boom, came from beneath our feet, a sound in the earth. We seemed to hear it with our feet as much as our ears. Its dull resonance was muffled by distance, thick with the quality of intervening substance. No sound that I can imagine could have astonished us more, or changed more completely the quality of things about us. For this sound, rich, slow, and deliberate, seemed to us as though it could be nothing but the striking of some gigantic buried clock. Boom, boom, boom. Sound suggestive of still cloisters, of sleepless nights and crowded cities, of vigils and the awaited hour, of all that is orderly and methodical in life booming out, pregnant and mysterious, in this fantastic desert. To the eye, everything was unchanged. The desolation of bushes and cacti waving silently in the wind stretched unbroken to the distant cliffs. The still, dark sky was empty overhead, and the hot sun hung and burned. And through it all, a warning, a threat, and through it all, a warning, a threat, throbbed this enigma of a sound. Boom, boom. We questioned one another in faint and faded voices. A clock?
A clock?
What is it?
Looking at me. Count.
Was Cavor's belated suggestion, and at that word the striking ceased. The silence, the rhythmic disappointment of the silence, came as a fresh shock. For a moment one could doubt whether one had ever heard a sound, or whether it might not still be going on. Had I indeed heard a sound? Cabo has joined us. Words fun. Words are fun. I agree with you. We've landed on the moon. For a little context of where we are, we have our true intrepid heroes have landed on the moon using their Cavorite, which is immune to the penetrating rays of gravity. And now they have lost their little spaceship that got them to the moon, and they're looking around in a panic. Anyway, had I indeed heard a sound, I believe is where we left off. I felt the pressure of Cavor's hand upon my arm. He spoke in an undertone, as though he feared to wake some sleeping thing.
Let us keep together and look for the sphere. We must get back to the sphere. This is beyond our understanding.
Which way shall we go? He hesitated. An intense persuasion of presences, of unseen things about us and near us, dominated our minds. What could they be? Where could they be? What was this arid desolation, alternately frozen and scorched, only the outer rind and mask of some subterranean world? If so, what sort of world, what sort of inhabitants might it not presently disgorge upon us? And then, stabbing the aching stillness as vivid and sudden as an unexpected thunderclap, came a clang and rattle, as though some great gates of metal had suddenly been flung apart. It arrested our steps. We stood gaping helplessly. Then Cavor stole towards me.
I don't understand.
He whispered close to my face and waved his hand vaguely skyward, the vague suggestion of still vaguer thoughts.
A hiding place. If anything came.
I looked about us and nodded my head in assent to him. We started off, moving stealthily with the most exaggerated precautions against noise. We went toward a thicket of scrub. A clangor like hammers flung about a boiler hastened our steps.
We must crawl,
whispered Cavor. The lower leaves of the bayonet plants, already overshadowed by the newer ones above, were beginning to wilt and shrivel,
so that we could thrust our way in among the thickening stems without serious injury. A stab in the face or arm we did not heed. At the heart of the thicket I stopped and stared, panting, into Cavor's face.
Subterranean. Below.
They may come out.
We must find the sphere.
Yes, but how?
Crawl till we come to it.
And if we don't?
Keep hidden. See what they're like.
We'll keep together.
Which way shall we go?
We must take our stand. We must take our chance. We peered this way and that. Then, very circumspectly, we began to crawl through the lower jungle, making, so far as we could judge, a circuit, halting now at every waving fungus, every sound, intent only on the sphere from which we had so foolishly emerged. Ever and again, from out of the earth, beneath us, came concussions, beatings, strange, inexplicable, mechanical sounds. And once, and then again, we thought we heard something, a faint rattle and tumult, borne to us through the air. That's a tumult, everybody. Everybody sippy. Gotta get you water. But fearful as we were, we dared essay no vantage point to survey the crater. For long we saw nothing of the beings whose sounds were so abundant and so insistent. But for the faintness of our hunger and the drying of our throats, that crawling would have had the quality of a very vivid dream. It was so absolutely unreal. The only element of any touch of reality was these sounds. Picture it to yourself. About us, the dream-like jungle. You gonna come say hi, library? He's very concerned about thunder. He might not come back up. Picture it to yourself. About us, the dream-like jungle, with the silent bayonet leaves darting overhead, and the silent, vivid, sun-splashed lichens under our hands and knees, waving with the vigor of their growth as carpet, or rather as a carpet waves when the wind gets beneath it. Ever and again one of the bladder fungi, bulging and distending under the sun, loomed upon us. Ever and again some novel shape and vivid color obtruded. The very cells that built up these plants were as large as my thumb, like beads of colored glass. And all these things were saturated in the unmitigated glare of the sun. They were seen against a sky that was bluish-black and spangled still, in spite of the sunlight, with a few surviving stars. Strange. The very forms and textures of the stones were strange. It was all strange. The feeling of one's body was unprecedented. Every other movement ended in a surprise. The breath sucked thin in one's throat, the blood flowing through one's ears in a throbbing tide. Thud, 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 thud. And ever and again came the gusts of turmoil, hammering, the clanging and throb of machinery, and presently the bellowing of great beasts. Chapter 11. The Mooncalf Pastures. So we two poor terrestrial castaways, lost in that wild-growing moon jungle, crawled in terror before the sounds that had come upon us. We crawled, as it seemed, a long time before we saw either selenite or mooncalf, although we heard the bellowing and gruntulous noises of these latter continually, drawing nearer to us. We crawled through stony ravines, over snow slopes, amidst fungi that ripped like thin bladders at our thrusts, emitting a watery humor, over a perfect pavement of things like puffballs, and beneath interminable thickets of scrub. And ever more helplessly our eyes sought for our abandoned sphere. The noise of the mooncalves would sometimes be a vast, flat, calf-like sound, and at other times it rose to an amazed and wrathy bellowing, and again it would become a clogged, bestial sound, as though these unseen creatures had sought to eat and bellow at the same time. Our first view was but an inadequate transitory glimpse, yet none the less disturbing because it was incomplete.
Cavor was crawling in front at the time, and he first was aware of their proximity. He stopped dead and arrested me with a single gesture. The crackling and smashing of the scrub appeared to be advancing toward us. And then, as we squatted close and endeavored to judge of the nearness and direction of the noise, there came a terrific bellow behind us, so close and vehement that the tops of the bayonet scrub bent before it, and one felt the breath of it hot and moist. And, turning about, we saw indistinctly, through a crowd of swaying stems, the mooncalf's shining strides, and the long, long line of its back looming out against the sky. Of course, it is hard for me now to say how much I saw at that time, because my impressions were corrected by subsequent observation. First of all, impressions was its enormous size. The girth of its body was some 80 feet, its length perhaps 200. Its sides rose and fell with its labored breathing. I perceived that its gigantic flabby body lay along the ground, that its skin was of corrugated white, dappling into blackness along the backbone. But of its feet we saw nothing. I think also that we saw then the profile of at least the almost brainless head, with its fat encumbered neck, its slobbering omnivorous mouth, its little nostrils, and its tight shut eyes. For the mooncalf invariably shuts its eyes in the presence of the sun. We had a glimpse of a vast red pit as it opened its mouth to bleat and bellow again. We had a breath from the pit, and then the monster heeled over like a ship, dragged forward along the ground, creasing on its leathery skin, rolled again, and so wallowed past us, smashing a path amidst the scrub, and was speedily bidden from our eyes by the dense interlacings beyond. Another appeared more distantly, and another, and then, as though he was guiding these animated lumps of provender to their pasture, a Selenite came momentarily into the ken. My grip upon Cavor's foot became convulsive at the sight of him, and we remained motionless and peering long after he had passed out of our range. By contrast with the mooncalves, he seemed a trivial being, a mere ant, scarcely 5 feet high. He was wearing garments of some leathery substance, so that no portion of his actual body appeared, but of this, of course, we were entirely ignorant. He presented himself, therefore, as a compact, bristling creature, having much of the quality of a complicated insect, with whip-like tentacles and a clanging arm projecting from his shining cylindrical body case. The form of his head was hidden by an enormous, many-spiked helmet that we discovered afterwards that he used the spikes for prodding refractory mooncalves, and a pair of goggles of darkened glass set very much at the side that gave a bird-like quality to the metallic apparatus that covered his face. His arms did not project beyond his body case, and he carried himself upon short legs that, wrapped though they were in warm coverings, seemed inordinately flimsy. They've had very short thighs, very long shanks, and very little feet. In spite of his heavy-looking clothing, he was progressing with what would be, from a terrestrial point of view, very considerable strides, and his clanging arm was busy. The quality of his motion during the instant of his passing suggested haste and a certain anger, and soon after we had lost sight of him, we heard the bellow of a mooncalf change abruptly into a short, sharp squeal, followed by the scuffle of an acceleration. And gradually that bellowing receded, and came to an end, as if the pastures sought had been attained.
He listened, and for a space the moon world was still, but it was some time before we resumed our crawling search for the vanished sphere. When next we saw moon calves, they were some little distance away from us, in a place of tumbled rocks. The less vertical surfaces of the rocks were thick with a speckled green plant, growing in dense mossy clumps, upon which these creatures were browsing. We stopped at the edge of the reeds amidst which we were crawling at the side of them, peering out at them and looking round for a second glimpse of a selenite. They lay against their food like stupendous slugs, huge, greasy hulls, eating greedily and noisily, with a sort of sobbing avidity. They seemed monsters of mere fatness, clumsy and overwhelmed to a degree that would make a Smithfield ox seen as a model of agility. Their busy, writhing, chewing mouths, eyes closed together with the appetizing sound of their munching, made up an effect of an animal enjoyment that was so singularly stimulating to our empty frames. "Hogs," said Cavour with unusual passion. "They're disgusting hogs." And after one glare of angry envy crawled off through the bushes to the right. I stayed long enough to see what the speckled plant was hopeless for the I stayed long enough to see that the speckled plant was quite hopeless for human nourishment, and then crawled after him, nibbling a quill of it between my teeth. Presently, we were arrested again by the proximity of a selenite, and this time we were able to observe him more exactly. Now we could see that the selenite covering was indeed clothing, and not some sort of crustacean integument. Integument, maybe? One of those. He was quite similar in his costume to the former one we had glimpsed, except that the ends of something like wadding were protruding from his neck, and he stood on a promontory of rock and moved his head this way and that, as though he was surveying the crater. We lay quite still, fearing to attract his attention if we moved, and after a time he turned about and disappeared. We came upon another drove of moon calves bellowing up a ravine. Then we passed over a place of sounds of beating machinery, as if some huge hall of industry came near the surface there. And while these sounds were still about us as we came to the edge of the great open space, perhaps 200 yards in diameter, and perfectly level, save for a few lichens that advanced from its margin, this space was bare and presented a powdery surface of dusty yellow color. We were afraid to strike out across the space, but as it represented less obstruction to our crawling than the scrub, we went down upon it and began very circumspectly to skirt its edge. For a little while the noises from below ceased, and everything, save for the faint stir of the growing vegetation, was very still. Then abruptly there began an uproar, louder, more vehement, and nearer than any we had seen so far. Of a certainty, it came from below. Instinctively, we crouched as flat as we could, ready for a prompt plunge into the thicket beside us. Each knock and throb seemed to vibrate through our bodies. Louder grew this throbbing and beating, the irregular vibration increasing until the whole moon world seemed to be jerking, pulsing. "Cover," whispered Cavour, and I turned toward the bushes. At that instant came a thud like the thud of a gun, and then a thing happened. It still haunts me in my dreams. I turned my head to look at Cavour's face, and thrust out my hand in front of me as I did so. and my hand met nothing. I plunged suddenly into a bottomless hole. My chest hit something hard. I found myself with my chin on the edge of an unfathomable abyss that had suddenly opened beneath me. My hand extended stiffly into the void. The whole of that flat circular area was no more than a gigantic lid. Now that was sliding sideways from off the pit that it had covered into a slot prepared for it. Had it not been for Cavour, I think I should have remained rigid, hanging over this margin, staring into the enormous gulf below, until at last the edges of the slot would have scraped me off and hurled me into the depths. But Cavour had not received the shock that had paralyzed me. He had been a little distance from the edge when the lid had first opened, and perceiving the peril that held me helpless, gripped my legs and pulled me backward. I came into a sitting position, crawled away from the edge for a space on all fours, and then staggered up and ran after him across the thundering, quivering sheet of metal. It seemed to be swinging open with a steadily accelerated velocity, and the bushes in front of me shifted sideways as I ran. I was none too soon. Cavour's back vanished amid the bristling thicket, and as I scrambled up after him, the monstrous valve came into its position with a clang. For a long time we lay panting, not daring to approach the pit. But at last, very cautiously and bit by bit, it crept into a position from which we could peer down. The bushes about us creaked and waved with the force of a breeze that was blowing down the shaft. We could see nothing at first except smooth vertical walls descending at least into an impenetrable black. Then very gradually we became aware of a number of very faint and little lights going to and fro. For a time that stupendous gulf of mystery held us, so that we forgot even our sphere. In time, however, we grew accustomed to the darkness, and could make out very small, dim, elusive shapes moving about among those needle-point illuminations. We peered, amazed and incredulous, misunderstanding so little that we could not find words to say. We could distinguish nothing of the world that gives us data to the meaning of the faint shapes we saw. What is it? What can it be? Engineering. They must live in these caverns during the night and come out during the day. Carla, can they be like that? It was something... Cavour, can they be that? It was something like men? He was not a man. We dare risk nothing. We dare do nothing till we find the sphere. And we can do nothing till we find the sphere. He assented with a groan and stirred himself to move. He stared about him for a space, sighed, and indicated a direction. We struck out through the jungle. For a time we crawled resolutely, then with diminishing vigor. Presently, among great shapes of flabby people, there came a noise of trampling and cries about us. We lay close, and for a long time the sounds that went to and fro and very near, but this time we saw nothing. I tried to whisper to Cavour that I could hardly go without food for much longer, but my mouth had become too dry for whispering. Cavour, I must have food. I got that character voice backward. Cavour, I must have food. He turned a face full of dismay towards me.
It's a case for holding out.
But I must. Look at my lips.
I've been thirsty some time.
If only some of that snow had remained.
It's clean gone. We're driving from the Arctic to the tropicals. At the rate of a degree a minute.
I gnawed at my hand. The sphere. There's nothing for it but the sphere. We roused ourselves to another spurt of crawling. My mind ran entirely on edible things, on the hissing profundity of summer game, or on the hissing profundity of summer drinks. More particularly, I craved for beer. I was haunted by that memory of a 16-gallon cask that had swaggered into my limpness cellar. I thought of the adjacent larder, and especially of steak and kidney pie, tender steak and plenty of kidney, and thick, rich, tasty gravy between, ever and again. I was seized with fits of hungry yawning. We came to the flat places overgrown with fleshy red things, monstrous coralline growths. As we pushed against them, they snapped and broke. I noted the quality of all the broken surfaces. The confused stuff certainly looked of a biteable texture. Then it seemed to me that it smelt rather. I picked up a fragment and sniffed at it. Cavor, I said in a hoarse undertone. He glanced at me with his face screwed up. Don't, he said. And so I put down the fragment, and we crawled on through this tempting fleshness for space. Cavor, why not?
Poison?
I heard him say, but he did not look moved. I crawled some way further before I decided.
I'll chance it.
He made a belated gesture to prevent me. I stuffed my mouth full, and he crouched, watching my face, his own twisted eye into the oddest expression.
Lord,
He cried, and he watched me munch, his face wrinkled between desire and disapproval, and suddenly succumbed to appetite himself, began to tear off huge mouthfuls. For a time we did nothing but eat. The stuff was not unlike a terrestrial mushroom, only that it was much laxer in texture, and, as one swallowed it, warmed the throats. At first we experienced a mere mechanical satisfaction in eating. Then our blood began to run warmer and tingled at the lips and fingers. Then new and slightly irrelevant ideas came bubbling out in our minds. It's good. Infernally good. What a home for our surplus population, our poor surplus population. I broke off another large portion. It filled me with a curiously benevolent satisfaction. There was such good food in the moon. The depression of my hunger gave way to an irrational exhilaration. The dread and discomfort in which I had been living vanished entirely. I perceived the moon no longer as a planet from which I most earnestly desired the means of escape, but as a possible refuge from human destitution. I think I forgot the selenites, the moon calves, the lid, and the noises completely so soon as I had eaten fungus. Cavor replied to my third repetition of my surplus population remark with similar words of approval. I had felt my head swam, but I put this down to the stimulating effect of food after a long fast. Excellent discovery of yours, Cavor. Second only to the potato.
What do you mean? Discovery of the moon, second only to the tail?
I looked at him, shocked by his suddenly hoarse voice, by the badness of his articulation. It occurred to me in a flash that he was intoxicated, possibly by the fungus. It also occurred to me that he erred in imagining that he had discovered the moon. He had not discovered it, he had only reached it. I tried to lay my hand on his arm and explain this to him, but the issue was too subtle for his brain. It was also unexpectedly difficult to express. After a momentary attempt to understand me, I remember wondering if the fungus had made my eyes as fishy as his. He set off upon his own. He set off upon his some observations of his own, on his own account. "We are," he announced with a solemn hiccup, "the creatures of what we eat and drink." He repeated this, and as I was now in one of my subtle moods, I determined to dispute it. Possibly I wandered a little from the point, but Cavor certainly did not attend at all properly. He stood up as well as he could, putting a hand on my head to steady himself, which was quite disrespectful, and stood staring about him, quite devoid of any fear of the moon beings. I tried to point out that this was dangerous for some reason that was not perfectly clear to me, but the word dangerous had somehow got mixed with indiscreet and came out more like injurious than either. And after attempting to disentangle them, I resumed my argument, addressing myself principally to the unfamiliar but attentive coralline growths on either side. I felt that it was necessary to clear up this confusion between the moon and the potato at once. I wandered into a long parenthesis on the importance of precision of definition in this argument. I did my best to ignore the fact that my bodily sensations were no longer agreeable. In some way that I've now forgotten, my mind was led back to the projects of colonization. "We must annex the moon," I said. There will be no shilly-shally. This is part of the white man's burden. Cavor, we are satraps. An Emperor Caesar, and an Empire Caesar never dreamt beyond the newspapers. Cavorica, Bedfordica, limited, I mean unlimited, practically. Certainly, I was intoxicated. I embarked upon an argument to show the infinite benefits our arrival would confer on the moon. I involved myself in a rather difficult proof that the arrival of Columbus was on the whole beneficial to America. I had found that I had forgotten the line of argument I intended to pursue, and continued to repeat "Similar to Columbus" to fill up time. From that point, my memory of the action of the abominable fungus becomes confused. I remember vaguely that we declared our intention of standing no nonsense from any confounded insects, that we decided it ill became men to hide shamefully upon a mere satellite, that we'd equipped ourselves with huge armfuls of the fungus, whether for missile purposes or what I do not know, and heedless of the stabs of the bayonet scrub, we started forth into the sunshine. Almost immediately, we must have come upon the Selenites. There were 6 of them, and they were marching in single file over a rocky place, making the most relatable piping and whining sounds. The most remarkable piping and whining sounds, rather. They all seemed to become aware of us at once. All instantly became silent and motionless like animals, with their faces toward us. For a moment I was sobered. Insects, and they think they're going to crawl about on my stomach, on my reverberated stomach. Stomach, he repeated slowly, as though he chewed the indignity. Then, suddenly, with a sort of fury, he made 3 fast strides, and leapt toward them. He leapt badly. He made a series of somersaults in the air, which whirled right over them. Which whirled right over them and vanished with an enormous splash amidst the cactus platters. What the Selenites made of this amazing, and to my mind, undignified interruption from another planet, I have no means of guessing. I seem to remember the sight of their backs as they all ran in every direction, but I'm not sure. All these last incidents, before oblivion came, are vague and faint in my mind. I knew I made a step to follow Cavour, and tripped and fell headlong among the rocks. I was, I am certain, suddenly and vehemently ill. Seemed to remember a violent struggle, and being gripped by metallic clasps. My next clear recollection was that we were prisoners, and we knew not what depths beneath the moon's surface. We were in darkness, amidst strange, distracting noises. Our bodies were covered with scratches and bruises, and our heads racked with pain. All right, folks, I think we will end off there on the cliffhanger of our two intrepid heroes' capture by the Selenites. They have been bound and chained beneath the surface of the moon, and next week we will find out just what that means, just what the Selenites look like, and just how much of a scrape our two mushroom-intoxicated explorers have found themselves in. Until then, this has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.